From the top rope and the Great American Bash, I bid you all good evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you may be in this great land of ours or around the world. Welcome to the $55 million studio on the Pro Wrestle Machine. Whether you're a longtime fan reliving these monumental events or a newcomer eager to understand wrestling's rich history, you're in the right place. This episode is packed with insights, opinions, and a few surprises along the way. Let's get into this issue. Through the use of the Pro Wrestle Machine. September 30, 1999 Observer Newsletter. WCW facing an uphill battle, Ecw Anarchy Rulz review. By Dave Meltzer. Whomever winds up in charge of WCW is facing an uphill battle, largely trying to get a snowball gathering momentum as it has picked up speed for more than a year rolling down a hill, to reverse its position and almost magically roll upwards. To understand that analogy is to understand just how deep the problems are. This is not just a situation where a business had a great year, set an expense budget based on that year, and suddenly business was way down and the budget is starting to bleed red ink. This is an entertainment business that is hot as hell when it's the in thing, and when it isn't, well, it can survive at a certain level, but since expenses are way above that level, short term, things don't look good. And if things continue unchanged in the same basic direction without improvements, 6 months from now, they won't be able to give those tickets away. More important is one thing for wrestling go down because the peak has hit, for overexposure reasons, etc., and have to go back to a more traditional product to keep its non-fad fans. Similar to what happened with the business at various points in time over the past 20 years, but the problems are not related to those problems. WCW cut its own throat with bad booking, bad television, and an organization that didn't care about satisfying its audience anymore. The fad fans have checked out, and the hardcore fans have had their intelligence insulted and are watching from afar, buying fewer and fewer tickets. The WCW hierarchy over the past 2 years of this direction figured there was no end to the golden goose even acknowledging those problems because, well, business was still tremendous until recently. Well, that goose was been stripped and there are no more golden eggs to be had. Hogan versus Sting can't draw a buy rate. Hogan versus Nash career versus career can't either. Goldberg's return or Flair's return or Hart's return on their own mean nothing because the concept is so flawed. It would be easy to keep going as it's going because pushing newer talent would probably in the short run, since that talent has been devalued for so long, result in even greater drops in attendance and ratings, witness quarter hours of late when the matches are actually really good. But keeping the same guys on top is a recipe for an even longer period of time before there can be any chance of a turnaround. Simply put, the only answer is to mortgage the present to hope for an eventual future. A concept for numerous reasons seems unlikely to ever take place. The easy answer, and the one the company has been using, is to say prayers that won't be answered, take vitamins that are now placebos, and continue to get their asses kicked. But who is on top is only a small part of the overall problem. This WCW faces the same challenge as WCW did when Ted Turner bought the company from Jim Crockett Jr. in 1989. It was a once profitable and very successful company, stripped of its goodwill by presenting fans with a product that turned them off, and quite frankly, the mistakes made by Crockett when it came to satisfying fans paled to the current product. Screw job finishes, too many turns and building around an old warhorse that had tremendous charisma but had seen better days in the ring, killed the house shows. And just as important for television, and this may be more important today than the product itself, is the production. As written here before, K1 isn't drawing 15 to 20 ratings in Japan for monthly specials because they have the best kickboxers in the world, although they do. They're drawing it because the events are presented as must-see attractions, the stars are made larger than life, they spend the year building to the blow-off at the end, and more important than anything, is what they present looks Major League. In fact, it looks more spectacular than Major League. Go to any major sporting event and you'll see emphasis placed on the trappings. New ballparks shoot attendance through the moon even with the same old team. WCW has no control over building a new stadium, and obviously a new goofy set doesn't mean a thing on its own. But WCW has fallen behind WWF at the house shows greatly, and part of the reason is a greater percentage of the WWF television stars appear at the live events. But another reason not addressed is atmosphere. People don't buy tickets for good wrestling matches, nor for an intense football game or for a technically great boxing match. They come to see what is hyped to them and is presented to them as a major league show. It's the atmosphere far more than the execution of the product itself to the casual audience that keeps them coming back. Spending more money on special effects at house shows is not the answer today because the booking and goodwill is such that they aren't going to draw with it or without it. but it is very important to start implementing and spending that money for higher production values at the house shows at the first sign of a turnaround. The two hot sports entertainment companies today are WWF and K1. Real versus fake of the two products is irrelevant because their successes come from atmosphere and marketing. There are things to learn from copying and blending the good aspects of both. When WCW passed WWF as a television entity, Nitro looked like a major league entertainment show. The atmosphere was fresh. The look was fresh. Ideas like the Nitro Girls were new, although they've gotten very stale of late, and replacing them with new members to basically dance to the same songs isn't the answer as much as coming up with a new concept for them. The idea of the spontaneity was new. You had to tune in because interesting things were happening. Then, and it becomes more clear in hindsight when the tide turned, even though the ratings were a dogfight from April through August of 1998 before WWF took over, the real turn was in the late summer of 1997, and I can remember it clearly. It was the first time I saw the DX ring entrance. It had nothing to do with who DX was, although Shawn Michaels was and still is a fantastic heel. Triple H at the time was an unproven guy at the time, pushed because of his look, who had gone through one failed push after another before starting to take off largely due to China. But it was the ring entrance and presentation that made DX special, and got everyone associated with DX over as major stars. WWF became a full-scale major entertainment spectacle, with the ring entrances, distinctive music, and the storylines with some wrestling thrown in. It's easy to joke about the WWF claims that they aren't wrestling. Pro wrestling is another of those semantic terms that means whatever you want it to mean anyway, like the argument of sport versus entertainment, when the answer to the argument in all cases is both. But they did innovate what wrestling was, just as WCW did years earlier with Nitro. Nitro, due to its fresh look and production, plus the concept of presenting mostly main event quality matches and cutting down and nearly eliminating the old squash format of television, blew away the stagnant Raw from its very first episode in September 1995, and again, it wasn't until May of 1996 that it became consistently dominant in the ratings. The NWO angle and the pushing of smaller, quicker, and better wrestlers helped, just as the ruination of the new talent to feed egos of older, slower wrestlers desperate to hang on to their position with more money available than at any time in their careers, started the downslide. With Raw blowing away Nitro on every level, even if Nitro suddenly develops new concepts and puts on a better show, with today's gap as large as it is, history shows we are probably a minimum of 8 months away from the gap being closed noticeably, and to make up a 3-point gap in the ratings, even in as rapidly changing a world as this is, may take a year or two. And that is all based on coming up with a formula fresher than and better than Raw, which is nowhere near as easy now as it was in 1995. If WCW thinks they can just be a profitable number 2 company, there are ways that can be done short term, but not with the current salary structure, and eventually that mentality will turn them into an AWA, but with a deeper pocketed parent company being allowed to keep them afloat. With that mentality, cutting back on salary, all the good talent will leave when their contracts expire, which will continue the snowball's decline and accelerate the pace. It would also be the worst thing for the industry, and particularly for the wrestlers, for WCW to give up the chase. But prudent economics may suggest exactly that, and certainly do, on the surface without thinking long-term, in a company that doomed itself in the first place with its lack of foresight. The minute wrestlers can't play off one side against the other when their contracts are up, and of all athletes in modern history, wrestlers have notoriously been the worst at doing this, partially because the representation of wrestlers and the industry itself is so primitive compared to real sports, which also explains why real sports teams that don't generate anywhere near the revenue as wrestling franchises pay talent so much better. That's when, no matter how hot the business gets and a lack of competition will also cool down the business, salary structures stay stagnant. Ultimately, if the public perceives of WCW as number 2, they aren't going to be able to fill the major arenas or draw the television numbers they have done throughout history. Even in the 80s, when Crockett was clearly the number 2 business, its promotion had a very loyal base of fans, smaller than WWF's, but no less loyal. The big difference which kept Crockett alive for a few years is its core audience believed it to be the better product because it had its strengths, including overall a much better in-ring product, and in its key markets, it was the number 1 company. Give me more media hype and more visibility against a better in-ring product on a national basis, and I'll win every time. But my competitor will also maintain a loyal cult audience. WCW has destroyed its cult audience far more than Dusty Rhodes ever did in the 80s for Crockett. In Crockett's heyday, his television ratings dueled WWF equally in most cases and beat them many years. It's just that nobody looked at TV ratings in those years. In fact, even during the weak periods of the WCW organization, like in the early 90s for example before Hogan, Savage, Hall, and Nash. WCW drew better TV ratings than WWF. WWF drew bigger crowds overall and better buy rates. Actually, Crockett really never got into the pay-per-view game before he went belly up, but there were cities that WWF couldn't draw in that Crockett owned, and other cities where they were in a dogfight. Ultimately, Crockett's demise was because of the aforementioned bad booking and a competitive business move McMahon made to destroy a Crockett pay-per-view, which he accomplished, which put Crockett so deeply into debt he had to sell to Turner. That move, creating Survivor Series and putting it on at the same time as Starrcade and forcing cable companies to choose, and with McMahon's wrestling being more established and more popular on pay-per-view, they chose him, basically making Crockett's first pay-per-view into a colossal failure at a time he needed a cash infusion because the rest of his business was going down. May have been brilliant in the short run, but in the long term, it came back to bite McMahon because it put the financial powerhouse Turner Broadcasting into the game. But for years, the people running WCW never had the budget to really fight for number one, so they became a bleeding number two. Eric Bischoff deserves credit for being the first one to convince the higher-ups to open the checkbooks and get into the real fight, and for a while, he was winning the fight, and eventually, he lost it. Unfortunately, somebody should have smartened Bischoff up on what really happened in the late 80s to Jim Crockett as opposed to some fantasy version that he thought he knew, because there was never a truer example when it comes to his fall than people who don't study history are doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past. So you're looking for an easy answer. There is none. To be competitive requires spending more money, and losing a lot of money right now. The company clearly isn't willing to do so by putting someone who is fiscally responsible for a bottom line in charge like Bill Bush, and from people looking at it from a pure business perspective, that's understandable, but pro wrestling is like few businesses or sports in its lore and its ups and downs. The closest analogy would be a movie studio. It requires spending money smartly for the long term. The short-term fixes like Master P and Dennis Rodman and Kiss were disasters, but even if they had worked, they were only short-term, because the answer is creating new stars and giving the new stars fresh main event matchups. This is still a business about money, and no matter what anyone says publicly, every wrestler can be signed with a good enough deal thrown their way. WWF has all its major players locked up long-term. And WWF has another advantage, which is a huge advantage in negotiating. And rather than go into detail as to what it is, two names spell it out: Bret Hart and Chris Jericho. The fact Jericho took less money on paper, and that nobody has for a second even questioned whether or not he made the right move in doing so, speaks volumes. Those examples only show it is going to cost WCW even more money to be competitive, but when the key WWF contracts come due to people who aren't past their prime, and WCW got some great mileage a few years around people who were years past their prime, WCW needs to outbid for them, which won't be easy. But they absolutely can't afford to give anyone creative control again. WCW really only has two choices. They can lose huge amounts of money for now, cut back to a AAA level company, run on a tight budget and budget to where they can make money on 3,000 fans and 2.5 ratings on Monday nights. Or they can lose even larger amounts of money short term, and be hopeful that it pays off in 2 or 3 years. Either way, some moves are necessary. There is no purpose to huge money contracts to anyone over 40 that isn't primarily a team player. A team player is obvious. They should suggest a younger wrestler to be elevated, and elevate them themselves. If they aren't willing, they serve no purpose for a company whose role has to be at this point primarily rebuilding for 2 years from now. Men past 40 are closing in on it, such as Sting, Hart, Luger, Nash, Hall and DDP, and the past 40 brigade and Steiner's closing in, are not the future of the company and the guys who the torch should be passed to. The present is screwed and no miracle angle will change that, so you have to build for the future. These deals are done and guaranteed. It's been said many times. The guys over 40 who are cooperative and team players have a value, and that is in getting young guys over and in doing so, keeping themselves marketable and fresh with matches with new opponents. The guys who aren't, have no value, and what they did in the past, even if the past was 1 year ago, is irrelevant. This is not to say bury all of them or even any of them. Bury isn't the word, but their job description should be clear, and they need to understand that in a rebuilding company, nobody over 40 can be counted on for when the dividends of the current changes come due. If they push younger stars while hopefully maintaining themselves in a manner where they can be pushed as special, they can achieve senior legendary status and still be valuable in moderation in the fruition of the turnaround. This industry has a long history of drawing huge money with past their prime stars, but not against each other in a competitive promotional situation without hot young guys being worked into the mix. It would still work today in WCW, except they've positioned themselves as old-timers wrestling and need a facelift from that perception more than anything to change that perception. A lot of people won't want to hear this, but there is truth that some of the younger, more talented wrestlers can't be headliners, as work the top match or two on the card. You have to go back to Danny McShane to find a World Junior Heavyweight Champion who was a true top-drawing main eventer. Danny Hodge was a true main eventer, but his situation was unique as he was a local sports hero, and people like that only come across a few times a century. Satoru Sayama was a huge success, and Jushin Liger was one of the biggest stars of the decade. But their size limited them as far as their positions on cards. They still had legendary matches and meant a lot, just as Rey Mysterio Jr. could have had he been protected the way New Japan protected those two. Marketing smaller wrestlers as stars is very similar to marketing untalented wrestlers as stars. They need to be programmed carefully and kept protected. Untalented guys need short matches. Smaller guys need short opponents. Dean Malenko was destroyed the minute he was put in a match with Barry or later Kendall Windham. Nobody called Malenko a midget when he wrestled Rey Mysterio Jr., and for that matter, Mysterio Jr. got over by being a small acrobatic guy with Malenko. But when he's in with a Kendall Windham, he looks like a 12-year-old. WCW killed one of its greatest advantages over the WWF, the action provided by the cruiserweight division, partially because none of the bookers had any experience with Mexican and Japanese wrestling and how to protect smaller guys and keep them over, and partially because the guys themselves didn't want to be called cruiserweights and ended up killing their own heat wanting to work with people they needed for their own sake to stay out of the ring with. Somebody needs to reinvent the entire concept of wrestling. That's what WWF did in 1997, and it paid off in 1998 and 1999. There was no audience clamoring for women ripping their clothes off. Paul Heyman used that concept in ECW successfully, but on a national basis. It wasn't as if the audience demanded it, or for all the swearing. But once it was established as the norm, WCW came across as behind the times not doing it. WCW can't present nude women on television or swearing to a greater degree, so it needs to change in a different way. They can present better athletics, but for it to work, it has to be sold to the audience hard by the announcers, and the announcers need credibility for that to work. And that in and of itself is not a winning concept, but it can be part of one. Whether the concept is announcers going all the way with wrestling being a work on television, sacrilegious to most in the industry, but it would then make WWF and ECW commentary and products archaic, then shooting fake shoots off the work. Heyman half-assed does this, as does WWF, and Bischoff tried this, but it was fake shoots off a semi-fake shoot instead of all the way, which WWF hints at times of doing. WCW could long-term help its television a lot with an announcing team consisting of a guy whose credibility is protected, as in never being made to look like a fool, working with a really funny guy, who, unlike Lawler, whose gimmick is to be a self-deprecating cool fool, but someone who is funny but not full of it. What a novel concept, particularly since Jim Ross and Jerry Lawler, or for that matter, Vince McMahon and Jesse Ventura, were based somewhat on that same concept, and you're just trying to modernize it another step without the predictability of Lawler, and this isn't a knock at him because I think he's great in his role, but you have to go farther in certain ways, particularly since I don't see TNT allowing someone to screech like a middle-aged adolescent, puppies, kitties. The commentary on the main show has to be aimed at teenagers and people in their 20s, using their lingo, and constantly shocking the audience by saying things they never thought they'd hear on television. There has to be an element of, I can't believe they said that on wrestling last night, because I don't see them doing skits in a topless club like they do on Raw to get that reaction. Asterisk once, and not a day earlier, that the company starts gaining a younger reputation, then go on the offensive strongly against the other company's weaknesses and brag about your strengths, and you can't do this until you have them. They have to be legitimate weaknesses, or this comes across as petty and self-serving. To some it will anyway. For example, ECW in its past could make fun of WCW and WWF pay-per-view shows after both had bad shows, but when one of them had a good show, if ECW tried to make fun of them, it wouldn't work. Ditto WWF, when WCW had a pathetic main event, making fun of the pay-per-view, the Hogan-Piper Age in the Cage was the perfect example, but don't make fun of a good pay-per-view because then you're the one who's the fool. Bischoff never knew the difference, and that's why he usually came across as petty and mean-spirited in his criticism, while WWF and ECW were able to better get away with knocking WCW, even during a period when WCW had the best overall product of the three. Asterisk obviously, and this almost goes without saying, wrestlers should be wrestlers and not on the booking committee. The free time they have for booking meetings should be spent becoming better wrestlers in the ring or marketing themselves as celebrities outside it. When Nash was made booker, A major WWF office name told me, and who liked Nash personally, that it would be the kiss of death because WCW hadn't realized that wrestling had evolved past the point where wrestlers could in a few hours a week do the booking and that television writers were needed to work full-time writing television scripts. The last 6 months has proven that true, and WCW to an extent has recognized it. The writers, almost as a prerequisite, have to have had experience in doing real writing of television, but also have a knowledge of wrestling and what works and doesn't work within wrestling. It's a very limited gene pool. Create and actively recruit new stars. This is a very difficult process, and one that will yield dozens of failures at least for every partial success. Actually, I really like the WWF model, although question some of their choosings. For example, the last thing the WWF needed was a 6'7", 330-pound uncharismatic guy like Prince Albert to make everyone except the Giants look small, as opposed to, say, a Steve Bradley. WWF is tremendous at marketing big guys, but big guy now is 6'8" and above. Once you've got Kane, Undertaker and Show in the company, and guys like HGH and Rock are medium-sized guys, so unless you've got a special charisma or unique athleticism, a guy 6'7", 330 is too big to usually be a good worker, but unlike in the 80s, is too small to be a huge monster heel. WCW desperately needs to work with a smaller promotion, or create its own, and the Jimmy Hart WCW Saturday Night Show, if done correctly, could be a catalyst for it, but it's not a complete answer. The power plant in its current form has clearly been a failure. I'm not there to watch it and contrast it with the WWF camp run by Dory Funk, which was a success, but WWF still dumped Funk from the picture, so he's a free agent right now. A camp with a wrestling coach and a hands-on interview coach is a must, particularly with interviews playing such an important role. A territory where guys work 4 nights or more a week is a necessity. WCW should embark on a loss leader program, running its own AAA territory. It could maybe even be called Georgia Championship Wrestling, but I don't like the idea of the show airing on TBS in the Saturday night time slot, because you don't want people seeing the guys that green every week on national television, because first impressions are lasting. You could give a potential project some minimal exposure on the show, if they have a good look and potential, exposing their look nationally as a tease so people know about them, but can't readily see them in action until they are ready. This developmental territory idea has been tried in the past, like to an extent when Bill Watts ran the show, and was largely a failure. The idea of running high schools in Georgia drawing 150 fans is terrible on the bottom line, and at the time the company was trying to make money, but new guys have to be put in the ring and new gimmicks for established guys should be tried out before being put on national TV to fail. The territory could use strong hands like Steve Regal and Brad Armstrong, types with experience, to work programs with the younger guys. The guys need experience at doing interviews, doing goofy angles, which if they work can be stolen by the national company, just as things like this were done in the old days, and learning to draw heat. WCW needs to actively recruit people with a good look and are world-class athletes, and the money and fame wrestlers can achieve today makes this a lot easier than in the 50s, when, generally speaking, better quality athletes by the standards of the time were plying their trade as headliners. There will be more flops than successes, but you only need 2 Rocks and 1 Goldberg coming through your system every 5 years to make it more than worthwhile. These guys could go along with guys who love it and will migrate to wrestling on their own. We've joked many times that if a guy who looked like Juventud Guerrera or Toshiaki Kawada or Mick Foley for that matter showed up at the doors of the power plant, they'd probably be harassed into vomiting in the parking lot and never be back. This goes totally against the grain of today's American wrestling, but protect the world title. When all else fails, a properly protected world title can still become a consistent draw. The champion should be a special position. Tons more care should be given to choosing who holds it, and when it changes, it should be a huge deal. It should never be used for a 1-week rating fix, which hasn't worked this year anyway. Even though WWF has used it at times when they were desperate for a television rating, the quickie title change for that purpose should be eliminated because it creates confusion and weakens the belt, and is detrimental for long-term business. WCW destroyed its title and thus its buy rates, since the title match is the pay-per-view main event. The title today can no longer make someone a real champion, but someone who is a real champion holding a title that is protected can be a tremendous draw, in the right program with the title a good part of that draw. ECW this weekend showed what happens when the world title slot is protected. They created a scene WCW simply can't have, and that's why their pay-per-view drew almost double the paid attendance of WCW's the previous week, a situation which is ludicrous given the respective economic resources and television audiences of the two products. Move Thunder to Sunday. The show is already getting killed and it's only going to get worse in a few weeks. Hopefully on Sunday, they'll have Monday totally booked so Sunday can be used as a vehicle for hyping Monday. One of the reasons Raw did so well is because what they did Monday was already decided by Sunday, so they could use heat to hype where Raw was going, giving them a leg up on WCW, which was so disorganized, they never were able to use their unopposed Thursday to hype much of anything. Scour the world for any wrestler, even if you can only get limited dates on them, who can help the product in the ring. If all else fails, the best in-ring product is not the worst thing to have, because 9 hot matches in a row with a reasonable presentation will satisfy most pay-per-view buyers, which is also something WCW hasn't done a lot of lately. There are numerous other things that could be implemented, but that's a start. But if anyone thinks that anything less than a total overhaul of the current system will eventually breed results, well, the only results they'll breed are a continuation of the present decline. ECW took some risks but largely hit the jackpot with its Anarchy Rulz pay-per-view event on September 19th from the Odeum Theater in Villa Park, Illinois. For one, it was one of the 3 best pay-per-view shows in company history. It was done before the largest crowd and gate in company history, nearly 6,000 a full house paying $208,000. The first time ECW has been in that money stratosphere. Almost surely due to the exposure on TNN, and it being the first pay-per-view available in Canada. As a pay-per-view show, it was seen by more people than any show in company history. Most importantly, ECW was faced with a problem in getting its ECW title off Taz, who was a lame duck headed to the WWF, while at the same time not weaken the title by putting it on someone who wasn't ready, Jerry Lynn, Lance Storm, or just incredible, or hurry it to the obvious pick, thereby eliminating the big money from the chase, Rob Van Dam. So the answer was Mike Awesome, who the company put together a deal to sign about 2 weeks earlier. It was a risk in taking someone who had never been a big name nor had any television exposure in the US in about a year since undergoing knee reconstructive surgery, and bringing him in as a surprise and putting him over for the title. Fortunately for Paul Heyman, the major risk was more the crowd reaction, which couldn't have been much better, since having Masato Tanaka in the ring with him, his favorite opponent, made it likely they'd have a spectacular match. The match wasn't the best match the two have had, but it was more than good enough to get the job done. A carefully scripted out presentation, designed not to bury Taz, who the crowd heavily booed when he came out since word was out he was leaving for WWF. A scene that Paul Heyman said shocked the hell out of him, as he thought there would be scattered boos but Taz would be over huge as a face to most fans, showing that unlike the other promotions, the power of the internet does drive ECW's core audience, put the title and the company over and left the audience with a good feeling. It was a risky proposition because it bordered on being overdone, since Taz's graceful exit actually got over bigger than the pop for Awesome as the new champion. But the belt itself was the beneficiary, which for the long term is what the company needs. Awesome, real name Mike Alfonso, 34, is a big man by ECW standards. They're going to bill him at 6'8", 300, which is a huge exaggeration of his real size. But since size is all illusion and ECW generally features shorter wrestlers, they may get away with it, and a spectacular high spot wrestler for his size. As his series last year with Tanaka showed, he can have spectacular matches, although nobody should underestimate just how good Tanaka really is. He's largely an unknown commodity in the United States, but has been wrestling for more than 10 years, mostly with FMW in Japan under the name The Gladiator, before finally jumping to All Japan, although the Mike Awesome name dated back longer than that, working Indies and Memphis. He was thought to have potential because of his size and look during the late 80s steroid phase of the industry when he was breaking in, but got his first break in Japan and basically has wrestled 90% of his career there. His ECW deal apparently makes him full-time, which means he won't be returning to All Japan. He also has his weaknesses as a worker and will have to be somewhat carefully protected by Paul Heyman in the spot, with short matches against the wrong opponents. When he was in ECW before, his matches with people other than Tanaka, in particular the Dudleys and Balls Mahoney, were by most accounts not good. And his uniquenesses, in particular the spectacular spots like the Big Dive, make him something of an injury risk, since he suffered many injuries in Japan, particularly coming off major knee surgery and being 35 years old in January. But he's not quite as physically impressive looking as Goldberg, but is about the same size and can do far more spectacular things in the ring. He's a completely different animal than Taz, who Heyman did nothing short of an amazing job of creating and protecting, which will probably become more evident if he's not similarly protected in the WWF. Since he's never had to do American-style promos in Japan, it's not his forte, which may be why Jeff Jones was given to him as a manager. But that's a mistake because Jones's angles and delivery is very amateurish and drags down a world champion. The scenario was an unadvertised three-way, involving Taz and Tanaka, the scheduled title match main event on the show. In a mistake in hindsight, the match was put on third from the top. Mistake because it literally was so strong that the last two matches couldn't get a crowd reaction following it, although Heyman said if it was on last and the scenario didn't work, it would have killed the show, so it was a position he felt he had to put it in. Just as the show started, it was set up by an amateur hour-looking angle, where Steve Prozik interviewed Tanaka, who looked blankly at him doing the dated can't understand English gimmick. Jeff Jones came out and Tanaka weakly pie-faced him, with Jones vowing something awesome would happen later in the show. Taz and Tanaka were in the ring when Taz began yelling at someone in the audience, which as it turned out, were Awesome and Jones. With Taz yelling, and with Paul Heyman getting involved, it turned into a three-way for the title. Taz was kept strong, suplexing both men all over the place until they double-teamed and both pinned him just 2:01 into the match. As late as Friday, Heyman's idea was for Awesome to cleanly pin both Taz and Tanaka himself, but after a meeting with Taz, decided instead to protect him by having both men having to beat him to eliminate him. This left Tanaka vs. Awesome as a title match. While the match quality couldn't compare with the tape of their match from last year's Heatwave pay-per-view that aired on the TNN show last week, the drama with the title at stake put the match over even stronger. Eventually Awesome, after numerous near falls, power-bombed Tanaka off the top rope through a table for the pin. Taz got in the ring and shook Awesome's hand, and teary-eyed, kissed the belt and handed it to him. The fans chanted for Taz, who hugged Paul Heyman and some of the other wrestlers. Part of the atmosphere that worked was putting everyone in the dressing room on the stage to watch the match once Taz was eliminated, thereby putting over the title itself. The chants were so strong Taz had to try and lead the chants away from him and to Awesome to create the desired atmosphere. Aside from that, it was a very good show, easily a thumbs up, and maybe the best pay-per-view this year. It had its strengths, in particular a strong work rate of the top wrestlers, and its weaknesses, a glaring lack of depth. What was bad on the show was really bad. While WWF and WCW can't put on a show of top-to-bottom good matches either, rarely, usually limited to a women's match in WWF, and only occasionally in WCW does it look like amateur hour. ECW had an amateur hour segment with people clearly not seen as ready for pay-per-view, but unlike WCW when they put out Kaz Hayashi or La Parka or Mike Enos, who are seen the same way, these guys also aren't ready. Raven and Tommy Dreamer, who have been the beneficiary of the most hype in the company in ages, are not physically ready, and their match drew no heat following the title switch. Rob Van Dam vs. Balls Mahoney was a weak ending to the show, even though both tried hard. The match had no heat because Mahoney is mainly a brawler, but aside from his willingness to do crazy things for pops and the trademark chair spot, is a decent wrestler and a lousy brawler who was seen as a mid-carder, and nobody bought any of his near falls on Van Dam. Van Dam's lack of ring psychology was also apparent in having to work such a long match. This left the match dead, since the entire story the match tried to tell was that Mahoney was on the verge of winning. On the bright side, Lynn vs. Storm contained some of the most spectacular wrestling and athletic spots on any pay-per-view this year, but because of the lack of talent depth, they were also out there 5 minutes too long for the crowd, and it exposed their psychology and transition weaknesses as the heat died out toward the finish. The three-way between Super Crazy, Little Guido and Yoshihiro Tajiri was also very good, but again, the crowd died in the last 5 minutes, taking the match done from near 4-star category. Sabu vs. Just Incredible had the second best match on the show, in a match that was considered by many who had seen them at the house shows as iffy going in. Another plus was the announcing. It was joked afterwards by a lot of people that Joey Styles should get laryngitis more often, because it forced him to save his voice, to tone down, and in a 3-hour show made him far more bearable. Don Callis, whose name Cyrus the Virus gets even more cornball in a bad way the more you hear it, did a great job of imparting actual information, a lot of which was new, with legitimate commentary with smart-ass heel comments. Van Dam vs. Johnny Smith was originally to finish the show, but Paul Heyman decided, apparently a few days ahead of time, feeling that Smith was unknown and that another wrestling match wasn't going to get over that late, put in better-known Mahoney as a brawler in a late angle to take his place. He's probably right, since Smith, unknown in Chicago and lacking charisma even though he's a great technical wrestler, probably wouldn't have gotten any heat after the title change. But 20 minutes of Mahoney didn't either, and the match wasn't good enough to carry Van Dam's Mr. Pay-Per-View mantle. The good news/bad news pattern for ECW continued as the next day. The TNN rating for September 17th came out, showing ECW falling to an 0.72 rating, barely beating out Roller Jam at 0.68 as the top-rated show of TNN's Thrill Zone Fridays. A one-week fall on its own doesn't mean much, but it was done on a show containing perhaps ECW's best match of the year, Van Dam vs. Lynn from Philadelphia, strongly built up on television angles for 2 weeks. More important than what could be a one-week aberration in the ratings is that no matter what the starting point was for ECW, it was believed the ratings would consistently move up from that level, and that isn't happening as their ratings over the past 3 weeks have fallen from an 0.97 to an 0.85 to an 0.72. A drop of 26% in just 2 weeks with no explanation other than perhaps all the televised wrestling on Thursday makes all but the most hardcore fans not interested in seeing any more wrestling the next night. 1. Lance Storm Lance Evers pinned Jerry Lynn in 1638. Lynn came out with ribs taped selling an injury from a recent TV taping. They did a great opening high spot. Storm is one of the best pure athletes in wrestling and his high spots are great, but going this long showed his weaknesses too much. In particular, his chops, which he used a lot of to do chop fest spots with Lynn, are even worse than his punches. He also does missed moves like clotheslines as part of lengthy high spots that look bad, and there is an air of over-choreography and mechanicalness to his lengthy high spots as opposed to the smoothness that the top Mexicans do the same type of thing. The actual wrestling was incredible. Lynn did a plancha to the floor. Fans chanted "She's a crack whore" at Dawn Marie, which Cyrus claimed they were chanting "She's a good girl." Styles did several saline and fake boob references on her during the show. Lynn did a very creative low blow spot. They did near fall after near fall. Lynn did a sunset flip powerbomb off the top rope into a jackknife bridge, but ref was distracted by Dawn Marie. Lynn used a DDT on a chair, but Marie put Storm's leg on the ropes. The match lost its steam with the crowd in the final minutes. Lynn used a stunner, which was an easy copycat pop, and a flying hurricane rana off the ropes for a near fall. Storm ended up getting the pin with a 3/4 Nelson cradle. They sold the match as if Lynn was injured to protect him since he lost at the end, and are also selling Lynn as being so obsessed with beating Van Dam that he can lose to other people. Heyman is clearly positioning Storm and Credible as the focal points for the future, but the crowd didn't accept the cradle wrestling move as a finish after all the spectacular spots. 3¼ stars. 2. Simon Diamond, Pat Kenny, came out and asked Tom Marquez to be his partner in a tag match, and when Marquez got up, he told him that he didn't say Simon says. Same groan as always. Jazz, Carlene Moore, came out and Diamond called her worthless. This led to Marquez versus Jazz for 58 seconds, ending when Jazz took a few bumps, came back with a groin claw and an X Factor, Jazz Stinger, before Diamond and Tony DeVito interfered for the DQ. Dud. 3. Nova, Mike Bucci, and Chris Chetti no contest Diamond and Tony DeVito in 3:52 when every prelim guy in the dressing room ran in. This was a disaster at the end. Nova used a pescado on both opponents at the bell. It had no heat, although it was all action, but fans see these guys as not being worthy of being on a pay-per-view. Chetti injured himself, and it may have been seriously, doing a moonsault and temporarily lost all feeling in his legs when his back went out, similar to a scary situation he had not all that long ago at a house show. He was in a lot of pain, and this injury was said to be more serious than the first one. He has movement and feeling in his legs after an initial numbness, and was scheduled to undergo an MRI this week. The explanation given was that the match fell apart because everyone panicked since whatever Chetti was supposed to do wasn't going to happen. DeVito delivered the single worst Uranage in history, then did it right the second time. Danny During and Roadkill ran out and Roadkill delivered the worst power bomb in history. It wound up with C.W. Anderson, Rod Price, Bill Wiles, Spanish Angel and Vito Lograsso all in the ring having a terrible brawl until New Jack cleaned house on everyone, finishing with 3 staple guns to the head of Price and a guitar shot. -1 stars. 4. Yoshihiro Tajiri won a 3-way over Super Crazy, Francisco Pantoja Islas and Little Guido James Maritato in 14:38. They finally dropped doing the kilos for Crazy's weight, so it got funnier. They had Guido at 201, he's probably 160, Tajiri at 213, maybe 165, and Crazy at 194, which sounds close to legit as he's a good 20 pounds heavier than the other two even though he was billed as the lightest. At least they're not paying him in pesos. Very well set up spots, which is harder in a 3-way because it requires more intricate timing. Tajiri did an Osai moonsault on both. Sally Graziano powerslammed Tajiri and powerbombed Crazy. Guido used a rocker dropper, famouser, off the ropes onto Tajiri. Crazy did a top rope Osai moonsault on both and then dropkicked Graziano off the apron through a table. They did an unbelievably good spot leading to Tajiri getting the tarantula on Crazy and Guido dropkicked him. Crazy did a rolling tapatia, Rito Romero special, into a dragon sleeper. Crazy and Guido did a combination camel clutch and Boston Crab on Tajiri at the same time. Finally Crazy pinned Guido after a moonsault in 9:18. It was excellent up to that point, but once Guido was eliminated, and I have no idea why, the heat was way down from that point. Crazy and Tajiri did one big move after another on each other, ending with Crazy going from his 3-rope moonsault, but Tajiri got the knees up on the second one. Tajiri hit a low drop kick and a brainbuster for the pin. 3.5 stars. In a really interesting segment, Steve Corino came out and said that Insane Clown Posse was going to be his mystery team to face Raven and Dreamer. He said that on Friday Alex Opis, the manager of ICP, called ECW and said that when they found out Raven and Dreamer were going to be their opponents, they informed ECW they weren't going to show up. Violent J actually appeared on Mark Madden's radio show in Pittsburgh that afternoon and said they were going to jump from WCW to ECW. In fact, they had actually put it out on their own website that they were leaving, despite ECW attempting to keep him quiet, but when they found out they were getting squashed in 2 minutes, they changed their mind. Corino said that he and Rhino would face Raven and Dreamer later in the show and really went to bury ICP. Styles kept it up, saying that ICP was ready to jump from WCW to ECW without giving any notice, and that Bill Bush should fire them from WCW. While I'm not sure ECW should have gone so far out of their way to bury them and try and get them fired, my feeling on this is that if someone cheats with you, the odds are that someday they are going to cheat on you, and if that happens, you come off looking bad if you cry about it. You know, the old Jake Roberts interview that you knew I was a snake from the start. There is a pretty strong argument for WCW getting rid of them over all this, but it's not happening. Since they probably signed a contract, this is probably a moot point. If the people who bought ICP records followed them to their pro wrestling work, they might be valuable, and I give them credit because they aren't bad workers, at least by the celebrity standpoint, although their ability on its own is also not major league level, and definitely have charisma. But they are cult celebrities who garner no mainstream attention for the product and don't mean a thing as far as ratings or anything else. If they want to be pro wrestlers, and they do, and they love it, they should earn their position and be given no preferential treatment just because they have a cult audience that clearly doesn't give a rat's ass about seeing them wrestle. 5. Just incredible, Peter Polacco, pinned Sabu, Terry Brunk, in 14:06. They opened with Credible and Jason saying they had a restraining order against Sabu appearing. Announcer Jim Molyneux said that since ECW has no rules and the match would go on, this whole Sabu being banned angle is so lame. I'm surprised WCW didn't come up with it. When announcer Bob Ortiz went to announce the match, Credible hit him with a cane. The lights went out and Sabu was in the ring. Credible used a leg sweep on the ramp. He used a plancha that put Sabu through a table. Sabu did a double jump flip dive into the crowd for a huge pop. Sabu went off the ropes with a hip attack to Credible's back through another table. Sabu did it again, but Credible moved and went through the remains of the previous table and cut up his stomach since he was going through an already broken table. They are trying to push Sabu in the commentary as a living legend. Credible juiced big time. Credible caned Sabu as he went to put Jason through a table. Credible dropkicked a chair into Sabu's face. Sabu used a DDT off the ropes. Credible got a near fall with a cane shot. Credible used a really lame stunner and came off a chair and put Sabu's face through another table. Since they did so much with no pacing or building, this match, like the others, got old toward the finish. Credible went for his spinning tombstone finisher, but Sabu reversed it, but Jason then hit Sabu with a cane. Credible hit the tombstone but Sabu kicked out. Sabu missed an Arabian facebuster and Credible again hit the tombstone, this time on a chair after a double reversal spot, and got the surprise pin. 3.5 stars. 6. Mike Alfonso won the ECW title in a three-way over Masato Tanaka and Taz, Peter Sinerka, in 13:48. Tanaka was billed as FMW Independent World Champion, although it wasn't pushed that hard in commentary nor did he wear a belt. Fans threw streamers to make it appear Japan-like, although the streamers were thrown all together when Taz was introduced instead of Tanaka, which was weird and looked real staged. The fans booed the hell out of Taz and did the "you sold out" crap. Taz then started yelling at Awesome to turn it into the three-way. Taz threw everyone around with suplexes before Tanaka hit the spinning elbow and Awesome followed with a splash off the top and both pinned him at 2:01. It was real smart to get him out of there so the focus became on the belt rather than Taz, and everyone knew they were seeing a title switch. Awesome did his running dive over the top. Tanaka was not at his best, which is the only thing keeping this from being one of the best US bouts of the year, probably due to jet lag, He flew from Japan to work ECW in Buffalo last Saturday, then flew back to Japan and worked through Saturday night in Japan before flying back to Chicago. So that's 4 15 to 18-hour flights within a 1-week period, and that'll run down anyone. He was slightly off on a few spots. He did the wind sprint chair shot running down the ramp. All the wrestlers were watching the match from the ramp. Awesome did a DDT coming off a chair onto the ramp. Tanaka came off the top rope with a chair to the head for a near fall. Tanaka messed up a power bomb spot. Awesome did the big spot of the match, the awesome bomb over the top rope, putting Tanaka through a table. Huge pop for that. After another power bomb and splash off the top, Tanaka kicked out. They did the series of chair shots to Tanaka's head, that always gets him over, and probably will wind up with him having 0 brain cells by the age of 45. Tanaka did a somersault stunner, called Diamond Dust, for a near fall. Awesome did a German suplex followed by a spear for a near fall. Awesome used a chair off the top for a near fall, then delivered a weak chair to Tanaka's chest. Fans sort of groaned at that. Both guys wound up standing on the top rope with the table set up, and their footing wasn't perfect, and one of them losing balance would have killed the moment, not to mention could have hurt both badly. Anyway, Awesome delivered the power bomb through the table and got the pin. 3 3/4 stars. Joel Gertner came out and got a huge pop. One of the biggest of the night for that matter, and called out Tommy Dreamer and Francine for an interview. No joking here. Francine is even skinnier than 2 weeks ago, and while the stick arms and stick legs and huge boobs is in, at her age this can't be healthy. She almost looks like Ally McBeal, but even more facially drawn except for the implants. Dreamer said he wasn't out there to do a babyface promo, and then kiss ass to the local fans talking about Sammy Sosa. Corino came out with Rhino. 7. Dreamer, Tom Laughlin, Raven, Scott Levy, beat Corino in Jack Victory, Ken Reinhurst, in 3:24. Rhino, Kerry Guerin, was out there as well. Dreamer sold his back. He willed Victory, still in the wheelchair, to Francine, who hit him with a chair shot. Dreamer tried the Spicoli driver but couldn't hold him. Corino brought a ladder in, but it wound up being used on him. Rhino body slammed Francine, who legit injured the ankle since she fell wrong. Raven ran in and DDT'd Rhino, then Dreamer DDT'd Corino and Raven DDT'd Victory at the same time, and they did a double pin. There was no pop at all for the finish and only a minor pop for Raven coming out. People have now seen this scenario enough. Mancow, the local DJ who is big locally and has a very small national following, came out with these 2 really fat guys and Raven left with them. Again, it's a good local house show angle, but on pay-per-view, you shouldn't be featuring local celebrities that 95% of the audience watching has never heard of, so to them, you're using non-celebrities and celebrities, which never looks good. Raven flipped off Dreamer and left with Mancow. Dud. Axel Rotten came out and called out Awesome, saying he wasn't a good worker but he knows how to bleed. Storm, Credible, Johnny Smith and Dawn Marie came out. They of course beat Axel up until Balls Mahoney and Spike Dudley made the save. Spike did the acid drop on Marie, allowing Styles to scream that there's saline all over the ring. Mahoney hit a chair shot on Smith that wasn't nearly hard enough to pull off the angle. Smith left and Axel tried to rile up the crowd with the idea of Van Dam instead wrestling Mahoney. It was embarrassing, and hurt the main event from the start, when his suggestion got no pop. 8. Van Dam, Robert Sotkowski pinned Mahoney, John Reschner, in 1939 to retain the ECW TV title. Very long match where they tried to tell a story, but as mentioned before, the fact nobody believed Mahoney had a prayer of winning and that they don't see him as a main eventer on pay-per-view. In fairness, they wouldn't have seen Smith in this spot as one either. It drew no heat. They worked very hard to try and get heat. Van Dam did a moonsault off the guardrail, but Mahoney caught him and planted him. Mahoney threw a chair at Van Dam in the crowd and drank a beer. Mahoney did a spin kick and both went over the top. Van Dam did a mistimed Van Daminator on the floor. Van Dam did this incredible somersault plancha 3 rows deep into the crowd. It's an amazing sight. Mahoney juiced for no reason. Mahoney got some near falls with no heat. Both guys brawling was not good at all. Van Dam's weakness is throwing punches since it's all arm with no body and noticeably pulled. Fonzie threw in a chair but Mahoney DDT'd high moaned the chair. Mahoney dropped him on his head with a pile driver, followed by a side kick and a very hard chair shot. Van Dam may have gotten a big welt from that one since his forehead looked swollen at the end of the match. Fonzie made the save. Fonzie hit Mahoney with a chair, and he didn't sell it. Van Dam used a Van Daminator off the top for a near fall, followed by a frog splash for the pin. Way too long. 2 stars. The WWF can add 2 more lawsuits to its docket this week, with a lawsuit filed by the company against Playboy magazine and a lawsuit filed by Nicole Bass for sexual harassment against the company. According to WWF attorney Jerry McDevitt, the magazine and the WWF were negotiating an agreement to allow the magazine to use the name Sable for the September issue cover and pictorial, but never reached an agreement before the issue went to bed, and they are suing for a percentage of the revenue. Rena Mero had already been signed to an $850,000 deal for her second pictorial after the first one led that issue to do near record business. In addition, they are requesting an injunction in federal district court in Manhattan to block the magazine from putting out a 96-page newsstand issue devoted to Rena Mero, called The Woman Formerly Known as Sable, that is scheduled to be distributed next month, for using the Sable name, and the company is set to sue for a percentage of that issue's generated revenue if the injunction isn't granted. Bass announced on September 17, in an article in the New York Post and an interview on The Howard Stern Show, that she had filed a $120 million lawsuit against the WWF that certainly on the surface sounds like a publicity stunt, seeing all the national pub Mero got out of her similar and quickly settled lawsuit. Bass claimed she was often groped and humiliated, claimed her breasts were grabbed by an unnamed WWF employee, and she was threatened if she complained about it. She also claimed she was supposed to be hit with a flimsy fake guitar but instead was hit with a real guitar, which opened up a cut on her head, and that the company wouldn't allow her to go to the hospital and instead super-glued the cut shut. Stern basically made fun of Bass' lawsuit on the air. The biggest story of the September 20th ratings was the inexplicable 1.73 rating for the 4-minute overrun segment for the Ric Flair vs. Diamond Dallas Page match, the lowest rated segment on a Nitro in many years and the lowest rated Nitro main event in the history of the show. The number was so low that it made Kiss and Megadeth late show concerts look successful in comparison. Inexplicable is because the football game, which did lower ratings than last week, was already a blowout by that point, and the Raw rating for the head-to-head period as the match at 6.65 was good, but no better than Raw has usually done of late in an overrun period in China, and Triple H vs. Test and Shane McMahon is probably on paper a weaker than usual Raw headline match. Flair's record for years as a ratings draw, even figuring in how much it has been weakened this year by his portrayals in his first match back in several weeks, should have picked up the ratings, rather than been a record low. It also anchored what up to that point was the best Nitro show in a long time, so it can't be blamed on bad television for 3 hours. The resultant lack of explanation left people shaking their heads, particularly since Flair's interview in the unopposed first hour did a strong 4.62 quarter, a number so impressive that it dropped to a 4.30 despite no opposition for the next quarter. Nitro early drops in ratings during the unopposed first hour, for the first part of the Sting vs. Chris Benoit title match. Overall for the night, Raw did a 6.03 rating, 5.86 first hour, 6.18 seconds hour, and an 8.9 share. Nitro did a 3.11 rating, 4.15 first hour, 2.88 seconds hour, 2.35 third hour, and a 4.6 share. Head-to-head over the 2 hours and 4 minutes saw Raw finish with a 6.02 rating to a horrible 2.61 for Nitro. The ratings for the night on the surface weren't necessarily a disappointment to WCW, even with the consensus that this was a rare occasion where Nitro was the better show, because of the belief that it's going to take a long time for things to change and the gap was the normal gap, but examining the viewer patterns in the third hour with Nitro falling so badly had to be a huge disappointment. Monday Night Football again beat last season's average of a 13.9 by a big margin with a 15.23 rating and 25.3 share. Raw doubled Nitro in every quarter except the first quarter, where Raw had the segment where Vince gave back the title belt, which included Austin and Triple H on the stick, doing a 5.35 to a 3.58 for the opposed section of the Sting vs. Benoit title match, and by the final quarter, with the beginning of the Raw Tag main event, 6.03 against Booker T vs. Canyon, and the beginning of Flair Page, Raw had triple the Nitro 1.98 audience. The rating for Sting Benoit, while dropping in the middle of a title match, still held up well enough to where it should be called a success, particularly since Nitro then fell all the way to 2.50, which is somewhat understandable for the Berlin vs. Scott Armstrong match. Raw peaked with a 6.66 quarter for Test and Stephanie McMahon vs. Jarrett and Deborah, although the final overrun, with more than 2 minutes going unopposed, with Test and Shane vs. Triple H and Chyna did a 7.06. Opposition for Raw's peak rating for the Jarrett match came in the form of Saturn vs. Eddie Guerrero, which did a 2.20. One obvious problem this week is that Nitro presented far too many too lengthy angle replay features during the competitive period, which resulted in channel switching. In other weekend numbers, Livewire did a 1.9, Superstars did a 1.9, and Sunday Night Heat rebounded from a week where it was bounced from its normal time slot and a week opposing the Emmys to do an impressive 4.34 rating. Heat, with usually one or two first-run matches, all nondescript, and no first-run angles, has maintained its audience with its super production, a blend of music videos and the kayfabe-breaking segments where wrestlers talk about past matches as if they are pre-planned performances. This past week was the Rock vs. Mankind Last Man Standing match from February, where the basic gist was Mankind saying it was a good match but he thought the finish was a letdown since there was no finish, and he knew fans left disappointed, while Rock countered basically saying the scriptwriters know best and the non-finish was deemed by those who know all as being the best thing for everyone. To the untrained eye, it looked like they were being open and shooting, but it was clear it was the people putting it together wanting to answer 7-month-old criticism of a finish that nobody really remembered anyway. Still, the show has been widely praised and it is groundbreaking in taking the television historical nature of the business into the realm of the new work. WCW Saturday Night did a 1.4 rating. For September 16th, all the news ahead of time about Vince McMahon winning the WWF title made a difference, reversing the downward trend of SmackDown with its highest mark to date with a 4.55 rating and 7.5 share, which may become the first episode to beat actual major network programming. Thunder also improved to a 2.36 rating for an unusual show, since the live event in Florence, South Carolina was scrapped due to Hurricane Floyd, and plans to pre-tape the show in Norfolk the prior night were scrapped for the same reason, so the end result was airing a string of pay-per-view and Nitro main events featuring all the major stars, focusing on all the world title changes over the past 3 months. For September 9th, SmackDown's 3.65 rating ranked at number 85 out of 118 prime-time programs. It remained UPN's best-rated show and allowed the network to tie WB for last place. Again, for the night, UPN still only beat out WB programming, even though all the other networks were still doing reruns. Japanese television rundown. September 12th, Dream Stage Entertainment Pride 7. This was a 4-hour-long pay-per-view show from Yokohama Arena. As Pride shows go, this was one of the best ones. The major problems with the format remains the lack of a stand-up rule, which allows matches to slow to a crawl on the ground for minutes on end, the ring and an apparent somewhat unfamiliarity with the rules of some competitors and a lack of sportsmanship of others, particularly the Europeans. A lot of people would include the worked main event as a problem, and as a sport it's the biggest problem of all, but the economic reality is they need to keep the Japanese headliners with drawing power over and working some matches is inevitable. At least this worked match accomplished its desired purpose and was entertaining, even if far more transparent than some of the other recent worked matches. The matchmaking makes little sense, but since they tried to have pro wrestlers in as many matches as possible since they draw mainly from the pro wrestling audience, that explains some of it. 1. Daijiro Matsui, who started out as a pro wrestler in the Takata camp, beat Bob Schreiber from the Netherlands via DQ at 10 minutes. This was a really exciting match, in some ways the best on the show because it was the wildest. Matsui was far more skilled, but Schreiber, whose nickname in Europe is apparently the Pig, looked to have him by 25 pounds or so. The advantage went back and forth with a lot of punching, kicking and wrestling involved from both end and submission attempts that didn't work by Matsui. Schreiber did a football kick to the head at 4:30 which resulted in a first yellow card. At another point, when a timeout was called since Matsui's gloves were coming off, as the ref was putting the gloves on, Schreiber gave Matsui a sucker punch. Schreiber did immediately apologize for this one. Matsui used a single leg on Schreiber, who fell through the ropes to the floor. With Schreiber on his back, Matsui was going for flying foot stomps, which has become the new Japanese technique to combat guys laying on their back. This would be illegal in UFC because you are kicking a downed opponent, but in Pride, you can kick a downed guy as long as you don't kick the head. Matsui also did some stomping on Schreiber's bare feet. Matsui was going for a heel hold, but Schreiber was holding onto the ropes, which is illegal, to keep upright and punching down with the other hand. The bell rang to end the first round, and after the bell, Schreiber delivered this totally vicious stomp to the back of Matsui's neck which knocked him out. This move was both vicious and dangerous enough that he shouldn't ever be brought back and resulted in a DQ. Matsui tried to go after him after the match but was held back. Needless to say, this totally blew away De La Hoya versus Trinidad. 2. Wanderlei Silva beat Carl Ognibena, a regular pro wrestler in Japan with the Battlers promotion, via decision after 20 minutes. Almost the entire match was on the ground. Malenko took him down right away, but Silva reversed it. A brief stand-up saw Silva connect with several knees, but none staggered Malenko, and Malenko took him down again. Silva threw more blows from the bottom than Malenko did from the top, and reversed him. They were on their feet momentarily again, with Silva throwing knees before it went back to the ground, where it stayed until the end of the first round. Silva dominated on the ground, punching Malenko in the head, and at one point nearly got a choke in. The second round was more of a ground stalemate. Malenko was on top, but Silva was still throwing more blows. It was really boring. Silva reversed him at 6:40 and got his back again and rode him until the finish, throwing some punches. Silva won an easy decision in a match that wasn't entertaining. 3. In what was billed as a contenders rules match, submissions legal, but not striking, Enson Inoue beat Tuli Kulihapai in about 90 seconds. Kulihapai was billed as a boxer from Tonga, so you can figure what this really was. Inoue wore a gi into the ring and tried to choke Kulihapai out with it, legal in judo, but wound up instead doing an armbar. Definitely a joke. 4. Maurice Smith beat Bronco Sikatic in 7:33 in a match of kickboxing legends. This wasn't a good match since you had two kickboxers, and most of the match was either on their feet in clinches or on the ground. Smith was fighting with a broken rib, which he got 3 weeks ago in his K1 match with Andy Hug. Sikatic, who is in his early 40s, Smith is 38, was not in good shape and didn't know what to do on the ground. Smith kept trying to take Sikatic down. Smith has trained with the Shamrocks in submissions on the ground but has done virtually no training in executing takedowns himself. Sikatic actually took Smith down with a cool hip lock takedown he probably saw watching pro wrestling, but had no idea what to do once he got him on the ground, and Smith reversed it. Technically, Smith won with a forearm choke, although it was probably more Sikatic wanting out of an uncomfortable situation on his back than a devastating submission. 5. Akira Shoji won a unanimous decision over Larry Parker after 20 minutes regulation and a 5 minutes overtime. Most of this match were the two locked up on the ground with neither getting much of an advantage. The few times they were standing, it seemed Shoji was doing better, but there were no telling blows. Shoji got a good flurry in late in the second round. Shoji probably should have won the decision, but in pride, if it's considered close, they just rule it a draw first to put it into overtime. Shoji pretty well dominated the overtime with punches and takedowns and won the decision. This wasn't good. 6. Kazushi Sakuraba beat Anthony Macias in 12:30. The fans were entertained by this one. It appeared Sakuraba was somewhat carrying Macias, or maybe he just couldn't figure out how to put him away. Macias was more competitive than you'd think, getting some blows in and having some advantage time, so it was a really exciting match. Plus, with Sakuraba, when he had the match in hand, doing pro wrestling spots, the crowd really loved it. Sakuraba built up in the press that he was going to use a double-arm suplex from pro wrestling in the shoot match, but the opportunity never availed itself, and really, I don't know how you could pull that off very easily without cooperation. Sakuraba got a big pop doing a quick Luthez Greco-Roman backdrop, and when they were on the ground doing Killer Khan Mongolian chops, and a form of a baseball slide kick along with a running double foot stomp when Macias was on his back. In the second round, Sakuraba didn't have the armbar all the way on, although it looked like it was about to be locked and Macias tapped. 7. Mark Kerr no contest Igor Vovchanchyn in 14:45. Although there were slow spots, because they were big heavyweights, this was also a really good match. They had a good standing exchange early where Kerr hit a strong punch and threw a good knee. Vovchanchyn, who is like Oleg Toktarov in that he's a Russian who bleeds easily and copiously, had a huge gross-looking cut above his right eye and a smaller cut above the left. Vovchanchyn came back and decked Kerr with a looping right hand. At this point, Kerr took him down and wanted to keep him there. Kerr was mainly concentrating on holding Vovchanchyn down, while Vovchanchyn, caught under Kerr's weight, mainly continually would punch Kerr right in the ear. This continued in the second round with Kerr scoring explosive takedowns, but Vovchanchyn from the bottom punching Kerr's ear. This was very similar to the Boss Rutten vs Kevin Randleman match, except minus the first 5 minutes where Randleman gave Rutten a serious beating, even though from a blood standpoint it looked similar as well. The finish saw Vovchanchyn escape from the bottom. He never actually took Kerr down, but Kerr shot and he sprawled and threw a knee on the shot, and when Kerr went down, threw 2 more knees, the second of which appeared to knock Kerr out. The 2 knees were illegal under Pride rules. At first the ref ruled Vovchanchyn the winner via the knockout. Kerr got up and protested, citing the blows were illegal. Backstage, the result of the match was changed to a no contest. Kerr himself admitted that had the match gone the distance, he was going to lose the decision. 8. In a worked pro shoot style wrestling match, Nobuhiko Takada beat Alexander Otsuka of Battlerts in 11:32. The crowd enjoyed it since Otsuka was there to show that their hero Takada really wasn't a paper myth. Otsuka opened trying a drop kick to the knee. He also tried a cobra twist, which was to buzz Antonio Inoki at ringside. When Inoki was shown to the crowd on the video screen, there was a huge pop as you'd expect. Otsuka took him down and tried a half Boston Crab. Sakuraba also teased going for that move against Macias. This was actually from a psychology standpoint very similar to a 50s or 60s world title pro wrestling match, except using different positions and moves as the high spots between the actual wrestling. In that comparison of style, I just saw a tape of a 1952 Thaz vs Vern Gagne match, and this match, with a similar psychology, was a better match than that one. Takada tried a fisherman suplex but was blocked, not in an exaggerated pro wrestling form but in a more realistic looking form, and Otsuka hit the move to a huge pop. The two threw a lot of spectacular looking kicks, but you could see they never punched or kicked the face. In the second round, Otsuka opened throwing a drop kick that Takada sidestepped. Takada came back with kicks and went for a guillotine, but Otsuka popped his head out. Finally Takada did the big finish, pounding away at Otsuka on the ground and choking him out. This can be viewed as a more modernized version of the late 80s UWF and early 90s UWFI wrestling style that had some majority popularity peaks in Japan. September 12, All Japan. 1. Jun Akiyama pinned Takao Omori in 24-29. This was a good match, but probably not as good as it should have been positioned as the Budokan Hall main event. The storyline here is that both wrestlers were born within a week of each other, Akiyama on October 9th/69, Omori on October 16th/69, and debuted at basically the same time, Akiyama on September 17th/92, Omori on October 16th/92. They tried to tell the story similar to a Rey Mysterio Jr. vs. Psicosis story, except it's not. The first big spot was Omori doing his axe bomber on the floor. He did an elbow off the top rope, but after it hit, Akiyama caught him in an armbar. Start was slow with Akiyama working over Omori's axe bomber arm. Omori came back but missed his bombs away knee drop and Akiyama worked the knee. Omori finally hit the axe bomber, but hurt his own arm since Akiyama had worked it in the process, so couldn't follow up. He finally hit the bombs away and another axe bomber for near falls. The match built well and in good heat for the finish, where Akiyama took control with an exploder, some high knees, a brainbuster, a high knee off the top, followed by two more exploders before finally getting the pin. 3 stars. Mexico. An EMLL trainee named Sergio Armando Villatobin, 27, who was coming home from Arena Mexico at about 11:40 p.m. after a workout on September 15, was stabbed to death and passed away at approximately 3:40 a.m. He wrestled small indie shows in Mexico City under the name Cronus and is actually best known in wrestling circles because in April he married Claudia Marquez, a former Box E Lucha queen of Lucha Libre. The stabbing actually took place several miles from Arena Mexico, but no doubt reinforced the idea from earlier in the year that Arena Mexico was in a dangerous area. Early in the year, EMLL was doing its most successful business at Arena Coliseo in years, but when it moved big shows to Arena Mexico, it couldn't draw because of the feeling it was too dangerous to attend. In recent weeks, there have some very healthy crowds at Arena Mexico, so the perception wore off. But with a loaded show, one of the strongest for what should have been drawing power of the year on September 17th, the attendance may have been less than 2,000. Part of the reason also is that AAA was running Juan de la Barrera Gym in Mexico City the same night with Pero Aguayo's farewell show, but that building was only set up for 4,021 seats, which sold out easily, but that doesn't explain a crowd that small. Since EMLL's biggest show of the year, the anniversary show, was set for September 24th, it now makes what was almost a certain huge house in question. The only news we have on the AAA show is that Pirata Morgan returned as the surprise heel in Aguayo's final match, which of course Aguayo won, teaming with Connect and Latin Lover to beat Sangre Chicana and Cibernetico and Morgan. The main event in the Prison of Death with Octagon and Heavy Metal beating Jacques Mate and Kickboxer saw Kickboxer as the last man left in the cage, and thus he lost his mask. The EMLL show was headlined by Elio Del Santo and Negro Casas retaining the CMLL tag titles, beating Dr. Wagner Jr. and Blue Panther when Casas gave Wagner a brainbuster for the pin. The finish was pushed hard, questioning whether the brainbuster, which hasn't been used as a regular move in Japan, was an illegal martinete, dropping someone on their head in piledriver fashion. The previous week Wagner Jr. was DQ'd for using a Michinoku driver with the ruling it was a martinete. In the match to set up the anniversary show main event, Atlantis and Mr. Niebla beat Villano Tercero and Shocker via DQ when Ref Tigre Hispano was knocked out. The heels destroyed Atlantis and Niebla after the match, ending with a double stretcher job and reported all-night stay for both in the hospital. The announced September 24th 66th anniversary show in a Parejas Increíbles, Incredible Partners, match with Atlantis and rival Villano Tercero facing Niebla and rival Shocker. I'm not clear if masks are at stake or if the losing team has to wrestle each other and the ultimate loser loses the mask, because without a mask, this really isn't an anniversary show main event. The only major stars being brought in for the show are Steel, WWF's Val Venus, Gigante Silva and Headhunters. Semias Silva and Rayo de Jalisco Jr. and Brazo de Plata vs. Steel and Universo 2000 and Apollo Dantes and Scorpio Jr., Santo and Casas and Olympico vs. Wagner and Panther and Black Warrior, Headhunters and Emilio Charles Jr. vs. El Satanico and Ultimo Guerrero and Rey Bucanero. Ricky Marvin and Sombra de Plata vs. Sangre Azteca and Fugaz, and opening with Virus and Rincor Latino and Violencia vs. Super Astro and Starman and Tony Rivera. Tarzan Boy, who wrestled in WWF as Armando Fernandez, announced his retirement to work in his family's law office in Monterrey. Charles Jr. and Brazo de Plata won a one-night tag tourney on September 14th at Arena Coliseo, beating Pierroth Jr. and Ricky Santana in the finals. Also on that show in a trios match, Pantera pinned Archangel to win the match, and the two ripped at each other's masks to set up a match for Archangel's CMLL welterweight title on September 21st in the same building. All Japan, only major news is that they announced a tournament for the vacant All-Asian Tag Team title, which Mitsuharu Misawa and Yoshinari Ogawa returned, from October 9th to October 25th, with the finals in Nagaoka. Teams involved are Tamon Honda and Masao Inoue, Jun Izumida, and Satoru Asako, Jinsei Shinzaki, and Kentaro Shiga, Masahito Kakihara and Daisuke Ikeda, Battlerts and Johnny Smith and Manukia Mossman. Rusher Kimura had an operation on his left foot on September 16th and missed the Fan Appreciation Show on September 18th, but will be back for the next tour. They had a blind draw card on September 18th at Garakuen Hall. But names were picked at random for various positions on the card, and the random picking was a shoot, so nobody knew who would wrestle each other until the show started, kind of like Nitro, or who would be in what position. As it turned out, tag title feuders Ogawa vs. Yoshihiro Takayama were in the opener, which was a 15-minute draw. The main event was Jun Akiyama and Haruka Eigen and Tamon Honda over Hasei Hiroshi and Mitsuo Momota and Jun Izumida. Basically how it was picked is that little balls were thrown by the ring announcer into the crowd with names of wrestlers on them. The fan who caught the ball then came into the ring and would pick names from a box, and whomever was picked would wrestle each other, the first two matches as singles, the next three as tags, and the final match as a six-man. Jumbo Tsuruta, who a legend with this promotion for his entire career, will be leaving his job as a visiting professor at Portland State University for the University of Southern California in June. Tsuruta studied under a Nobel Prize-winning physician in kinesiology and in theories on how to train the body for sports and injury rehabilitation using light weights, earning a master's degree after his full-time wrestling career ended prematurely due to contracting hepatitis B. Tsuruta was a Hall of Fame wrestler who moved himself and his family from Japan to Portland earlier this year amidst the front office fallout from the death of Shohei Baba. Tsuruta is said to be financially set for life from the money he's made both in wrestling and parlayed into real estate, and has told people that Shohei Baba was actually worth $450 million at the time of his death due to all his real estate holdings. I'd take that figure with a grain of salt, but it isn't as if people who knew him well haven't told me the same thing. September 5th TV show did a 3.5 rating. New Japan. Masahiro Chono suffered a hernia in a match September 16th Miyagi, where he and Don Fry beat Shinya Hashimoto and Meng in the main event and will be out of action for the rest of the week. The injury screwed up the tag team tournament, which at press time for the September 23rd final at Budokan Hall has Keiji Muto, who himself has knee problems so bad he hurts just walking and it severely limits what he can do in the ring, and Scott Norton against either Yuji Nagata and Manabu Nakanishi or Satoshi Kojima and Hiroyoshi Tenzan. Tenzan and Kojima have to beat Kensuke Sasaki and Kazuyuki Fujita on September 22nd to stay alive in the tournament. Standings as of September 21st were 1. Muto and Norton 5-1. 2. Nagata and Nakanishi 4-2. 3. Kojima and Tenzan 4-3. 4. Brian Johnston and Takashi Iizuka 3 and 4, Michiyoshi Ohara and Tatsutoshi Goto 3 and 4, and Meng and Shinya Hashimoto 3 and 4. 7. Junji Hirata and Shiro Koshinaka 2 and 4, and 8. Fujita and Sasaki 2 and 5. After this tour, Muto will fly to Minneapolis for more shots to alleviate the pain in his bad knees. Chono will be out the rest of the tour but will wrestle Hashimoto on October 11th at the Tokyo Dome. They are also doing an interesting angle where Fry is training Hashimoto in UFC-style fighting for his match with Naoya Ogawa at the Dome, since Fry and Ogawa have always had a major feud. Ogawa and Antonio Inoki were at the September 14th New Japan show in Joetsu, and Ogawa tried to attack Hashimoto. Fry got a really big win in the Miyagi show in the tag where he beat Hashimoto with a choke. It certainly appears, with Hashimoto having done so many jobs since his return, that he's supposed to beat Ogawa at the Dome. Ogawa talked about defending the NWA title in the match. There are a lot of politics behind this. The original plan for the NWA title was for Ogawa to lose it on September 25th in Charlotte, but with his opponents in the three-way being Gary Steele and Brian Anthony, that doesn't seem to make sense, so he'd be champion at the Dome. Deals would have to be brokered since New Japan has exclusive business dealings with WCW, which may preclude an NWA title match on their show, or Hashimoto holding the NWA title, even though having such a major name with the belt would give the title prestige at least internationally. There's also the American political problems, as it once again would be a world champion that the members have little access as far as booking on their shows. It's also interesting, and I don't know the explanation for it, but that on the shows Chono missed, which included big shows in Osaka and Nagoya, Fry, scheduled as his partner in tag matches, didn't work those shows. Fry will team for the first time with Genichiro Tenryu against Kensuke Sasaki and Brian Johnston on September 23rd at Budokan Hall in a match designed to build heat for the Tenryu vs Sasaki Tokyo Dome match. The War promotion, which Tenryu formerly owned, and of late has been run by his brother-in-law Takei, saw an announcement made where he was vacating the presidency, which apparently is a sign the company has lost a lot of money and is in danger of closing up. Tenryu has been earning most of his money this year already working for New Japan. Tatsumi Fujinami is trying to arrange meetings with Bill Bush to continue the talent trading. The next tour will be October 15th to November 1st, called the Fall in Black 1999 Tour, with the gimmick that Chono and Team 2000 will be booking the tour. Similar to the NWO Typhoon Tour at the same time last year, appearing are NWO Sting, Michael Wallstreet and Dr. Wagner Jr. for the entire tour, and Chris Benoit and Dean Malenko for the first week of the tour, which includes a major show on October 17th in Kobe and October 19th in Fukuoka. The final night of the tour is November 1st at Hiroshima Sun Plaza Arena. As far as the tag tournament went this past week, September 14th in Joetsu before a sellout 4,000 saw Meng and Hashimoto over Johnston and Takashi Iizuka, Kojima and Tenzan over Junji Hirata and Shiro Koshinaka, and Muto and Orton over Fujita and Sasaki. September 15th in Kawasaki before 2,500 saw Sasaki and Fujita beat Johnston and Iizuka, Michiyoshi Ohara and Tatsutoshi Goto upset Fry and Chono when Goto pinned Chono after his dangerous backdrop. Hirata and Koshinaka upset Meng and Hashimoto, and Muto and Norton beat tag champs Yuji Nagata and Manabu Nakanishi. September 16th in Miyagi before 3,800 saw Johnston and Iizuka over Koshinaka and Hirata, Nagata and Nakanishi over Ohara and Goto, Kojima and Tenzan over Muto and Norton when Kojima pinned Muto after a diamond cutter and two lariats to finally gain some revenge for his two singles losses over the past 2 months, and Chono and Fry beat Meng and Hashimoto when Fry choked Hashimoto. September 18th in Nagoya before 9,000 fans, about 500 shy of capacity, saw Tenzan and Kojima get the forfeit over Chono and Fry, plus in the ring, Ohara and Goto beat Hirata and Koshinaka, Nagata and Nakanishi beat Fujita and Sasaki, and Muto and Norton beat Hashimoto and Meng when Muto pinned Meng after a Frankensteiner. September 19th in Osaka before 4,000 saw Johnston and Iizuka beat Ohara and Goto, Hashimoto and Meng beat Fujita and Sasaki, and Nagata and Nakanishi beat Kojima and Tenzan. September 20th in Ueda before 2,300 saw Johnston and Iizuka beat Kojima and Tenzan, and Meng and Hashimoto beat Nagata and Nakanishi. Other Japan notes. Rings ran September 15th at Korakuen Hall before a sellout 2,000 with what on paper looks like a mostly if not all shoot show. On the main event, Yoshihisa Yamamoto beat Valentin Overeem in 3:35, and then after the match Yamamoto challenged Naoya Ogawa to a match. Akira Maeda announced the company would be running its annual Battle Dimension tournament after all. This year being a 32-man tournament and claiming lots of big names would be brought in due to the $376,000 in total prize money being offered. None were named, and even though it starts in 1 month, most of the recruiting is now going on. There will be 16 fighters brought in for the October 28 Tokyo show, which will have 8 first-round matches plus 4 second-round matches. On December 22nd in Osaka will be a similar tournament with 2 rounds. The final 8 will then have a UFC-style one-night tournament in February in Tokyo. The purse money will be $3,000 to all first-round losers, $5,000 to all second-round losers, $8,000 for third-round losers, $13,000 for the 2 fourth-round losers, $33,000 for the loser of the championship match, and $223,000 to the tournament winner. It will be interesting to see what the lure of a first prize like that will bring to the table, because even second place at $33,000 and having to win 4 fights and lose a final over just 2 nights to get that purse seems like an awfully hard way to make money. This announcement is said to be the biggest news in the martial arts world in Japan because the plan right now is for it to be a total shoot tournament. It will be an open weight class with all matches fought in 2 5-minute rounds plus an overtime round if no decision is rendered, and then the judges decide who advances. Yellow cards for fouls during the tournament will result in a 10% of purse fine, and a red card is an additional 20% fine. WWF is really picking up major popularity in Japan with Raw, Live Wire, Shotgun and Superstars all airing on either Fox Network Japan or Sky Sports 3, with the heavy emphasis on Austin and McMahon as the 2 top stars. Koto Fuyuki and FMW President Arai went with Masato Tanaka to the ECW pay-per-view show in Chicago and were trying to negotiate some talent trading. Relations between the two companies for various reasons have been on again off again over the past year, but now FMW has a big show on November 23rd at Yokohama Arena and needs outside talent, while Paul Heyman is looking to book Tanaka when he's available and on pay-per-view shows. Nothing is definite other than Tanaka may work ECW in between tours, and that FMW is looking at getting Raven, Tommy Dreamer, Lance Storm, Justin Credible, Balls Mahoney, Jazz and Miss Congeniality for the big show, and may try and book some talent for its October tour as well. FMW is also attempting to book talent from the WWF through Victor Quiñones but haven't been able to get an answer about anything. WWF was looking at sending Steve Williams for the next tour, but that fell apart because Williams refused to go, not wanting to work in competition with All Japan because of his long-standing relationship with that office. They also started an angle between the fake Hayabusa, Mr. Ganasuke, who in the magazines has photos from the hospital claiming to have had knee surgery, and Fuyuki after a split-up in a tag match on September 17 in Kumagaya. Also, Yukihiro Kanemura, who is Korean, has changed his ring name to Kentaro Kanemura, after Korea's most famous wrestler in history, Kentaro Oki. Gia ran a hugely successful event on September 15 at Yokohama Bunka Gym, drawing an overflow crowd. Announced at 6,300, there is no way to put that many people into that building, but told it was legit more than 5,000, for the Chigusa Nagio vs Lioness Asuka rematch, which Nagio won after blowing a fireball and delivering a Death Valley driver in 1947. Due to the stiffs, Nagio regains control of the Gia promotion and the president title from Asuka. After the match, Asuka shook Nagio's hand and asked to reform their legendary tag team for the first time in about 11 years, to feud with Akira Hokuto and others. Also, Asia Kong beat Meiko Satomura in an AW singles title match, and Sugar Sato and Chikeo Nagashima beat Kaoru and Toshio Yamada in an AW tag title match. Plus Hokuto and Mayumi Ozaki beat Atsuko Mita and Mima Shimoda. This was said to have been a really good show. In Michinoku Pro on September 15 in Notary, Great Sasuke retained the NWA middleweight title, beating Challenger Masayoshi Motegi under a masked JWP on September 23 at Korakuen Hall headlines, with JWP champ Azumi Hyuga defending against Carlos Amano in an I Quit match. White Bear in the Michinoku Pro Masked Man tournament was Jason Cross of Cardiff, Wales. All Japan Women drew one of its worst crowds in years at Korakuen Hall on September 15, estimated at about 800, with an LLPW vs AJW match with Eagle Sawai and Carol Midori and Sayuri Okino over Nani Takahashi and Momoi Nakanishi and Miho Wakizawa on top. Asia Kong retained her Queen of Version title on September 19 in Odawara, going to a 30-minute draw against Mima Shimoda. Kazuo Sakurada, Kendo Nagasaki, is reopening his Now promotion on October 8 at Tokyo Komazawa Olympic Park Gym with a show featuring largely women wrestlers from JWP and AJW and headlined by himself and protege Yuichi Taniguchi and Kishin Kawabata in a 6-man match against 3 mystery opponents. Here and there. The first indie pay-per-view show in a long time will be called the Heroes of Wrestling Extravaganza on October 10th from Bay St. Louis, Mississippi. No matches are announced, but billed as appearing are King Kong Bundy, Jimmy Snuka, George Steele, Jake Roberts, Bushwhackers, Jim Neidhart, Greg Valentine, Tully Blanchard, Stan Lane, Marty Jannetty, and Sherry Martel. Naoya Ogawa will be wrestling 2 other matches in the U.S. besides the NWA 51st anniversary show in Charlotte. He's also scheduled against Biggie Biggs for Rick O'Brien in Staten Island and on October 2nd against Gary Steele for Tony Rumble somewhere in Connecticut. Both Jerry Lawler and Jim Cornette have pulled out of the September 25th NWA anniversary show in Charlotte, Lawler because of a political commitment and Cornette because he's opting to work for Randy Hales in Memphis that morning instead. Ron Garvin vs. Stan Lane with Tommy Young as referee has been added to the show. Ricky Steamboat, Luthez, Tim Woods, Abe Jacobs, Sweet Hansen, Nelson Royal, Don and Wally Kernodle, Keith Larson wrestling name, are among those that will appear at the NWA Fan Festival that afternoon. Add Jesse Ventura to the list of those mad at Playboy. Ventura was on the radio saying he agreed to do an interview for the magazine because he was told it would appear in the December Millennium issue. As it turns out, the interview will be in the November issue. It doesn't seem like a big deal, but Ventura is claiming they deceived and double-crossed him. He's also forming his own video and record label which will produce a Ventura CD entitled We Rock the World and a documentary of the same name. The CD will have recordings from local musicians with quotes from the governor, while the documentary will review the campaign, election, inauguration and post-inauguration. Stampede Wrestling returned to television this weekend as a regular weekly program for the first time since the promotion folded in late 1989. The promotion, run by Ross and Bruce Hart, had its first television show air in a strong noon Saturday time slot, which was a tape of the card in April. They are now running television tapings every Friday night at the Pavilion in Calgary, the site of Stampede Wrestling tapings in the 60s, 70s and 80s, which will air the next afternoon. They are also running weekly shows starting this weekend every Saturday in Edmonton, same as in the old era. The original television show included both matches from April and an early 80s match that included Davey Boy Smith, Brett, and Bruce Hart, Danny Davis, and Dynamite Kid. There was also a story that ran on the Canadian press wires this past week as Martha Hart spoke to more than 10,000 people in Calgary on September 19th for dedication of a tree in the name of Owen. Funniest line of the week on a television wrestling show came from a usually unfunny individual, Kevin Lawler. Lawler, when speaking about Kurt Angle, said he was a good-looking guy and he was your typical boy next door, saying that not only that, he married the girl next door. The only problem was he must have lived next door to a strip club. On this week's show, Steve Bradley was calling new valet Shin, former California indie valet Stacy Goff, a fine Christian girl, and then she asked Dave Brown for a light. Lance Jade had a pizza delivered to him while sitting in the crowd heckling the wrestlers. He didn't tip the delivery man. Bradley beat Kurt Angle to keep the PPW title by holding tights. Angle then did the shamrock and suplexed the ref after the match. The new huge African-American guy they're pushing is called Ali Stevens. Jade ended up throwing the pizza into a security guard's face when they went to toss him from the studio, and Dave Brown was tired of him yelling boring. Randy Hales returned this week to lay out both Cornette and Kevin Christian Lawler with garbage cans and said he was back in charge and challenged Cornette to a match that night. Brian Christopher returned on the show and will referee the Cornette vs. Hales match. Christopher is a heel, saying that Hales never once called him when he was recovering from knee surgery. September 18th, Memphis TV Jerry Lawler appeared for Ohio Valley Wrestling on September 15th in Louisville, teaming with the Damager to beat Rob Conway and Bull Buchanan, WWF Recon, in the main event. Buddy Landell, who has gained a lot of weight looking like a Buddy Rose somewhere between his AWA and WWF weight, has appeared on a few OVW shows of late. Future Wrestling Alliance on October 2nd in Pottsville, Pennsylvania. For more info, call 570-385-2065. Professional Outlaw Wrestling has a War Games on October 1st at the Westchester, Pennsylvania National Guard Armory. AWA on October 9th in Joliet, Illinois at the Central High School with King Kong Bundy, George Steele, Iron Sheik and Doink the Lombardi. Saw an ad for a show this past weekend in North Versailles, Pennsylvania with the main event billed as Vader vs. the Warrior. Warrior was clearly not Jim Hellwig, but a guy with face paint made out to look like he was him. Jason Sensation of some really hot WWF Angle fame, the guy who did the Owen Hart imitation, has been training in Toronto to be a wrestler and will debut shortly in the area. Chris Pope at 2215 24th Avenue South, Minneapolis, Minnesota 55406 is going to publish a book on pro wrestling collectibles. They are looking to hear from fans who have wrestling merchandise from every era, who would either like to sell it or would enjoy having photos of it appear in a book. The Dallas Morning News did a story this past week on Kevin Von Erich. He made a comment that he's the only person who is a celebrity simply for the fact that he didn't die young. There was yet another child death that isn't getting pub as being wrestling related due to conditions involved. A 6-year-old from Port Jervis, New York who was about to enter first grade died from a viral heart infection. The 6-year-old was kicked in the stomach when he and other friends were doing an imitation pro wrestling match the night before. The autopsy showed the death appeared to be unrelated to the blows. On September 20th on NBC Dateline, they aired yet another story of a 12-year-old boy viciously beating to death a 7-year-old girl, and there were ties to wrestling in that the 12-year-old was a wrestling fan, although at that age he's more than old enough to know what he's doing, and the crime was especially savage. An estimated 3,500 fans showed up for an indie show on September 17th in Little Rock, Arkansas, which included Chains, Brian Lee, J.C. Ice, Brickhouse Brown, Kane, Bob Holly, Tatanka, and Jim Duggan. Jeff Jarrett and Miss Kitty were also advertised but no-showed. It was the first time any WWF performers had come to Little Rock since a highly publicized riot at a WWF event at Barton Coliseum in late 1997, when the show was stopped before the main event was started because the crowd became so unruly in its reactions to Shawn Michaels and no refunds were offered. Chad Collier and Perro Russo, which is Spanish for Russian dog, are scheduled to tour for the Australasian Wrestling Federation in September. Both have worked of late with Michinoku Pro Wrestling. Reckless Youth never appeared in England on September 12th for his match with Jody Fleisch. Luke Poirier, who is Sniper in WWF and more famous as Rambo in Europe, has been working for the CCC promotion in Hanover, Germany. Poirier will apparently be coming to WCW to replace Chris Adams in the European trio with Steve Regal and David Taylor. Crowds for Hanover for the tournament ranged from 400 when Poirier, who was a big star for Otto Wanz as a headliner against the likes of Road Warrior Hawk and Vader, was there to a low of 28 when he wasn't. Steve Wright, the father of Alex, is making a comeback in Hanover for a match against Miles Zerno, an old rival. Wright, one of the all-time great scientific wrestlers in Europe who had classic for their time matches with Satoru Sayama in Japan and also headlined in California and Mexico during his career, is only 46 according to Japanese publications, but that sounds young because he was already working the US and Mexico in the early 70s. Speaking of names from that era, Dr. Ken Ramey, a tremendous heat-getting 60s and 70s manager and gym star, who he managed along with Billy Garrett as the Masked Interns, ran an indie show on September 18th in Texarkana, Arkansas. MMA. Pancrase held a pay-per-view show on September 18th at Tokyo Bay NK Hall before 5,800 fans. The show was said to have been a success in the ring, but not a financial success. The crowd was heavily papered and they needed pay-per-view revenue to make it in Japan. Pay-per-view is in its infancy, so Sky Perfect TV, seeing the potential for the future, actually pays for events like Pancrase, UFC, Pride and Pro Wrestling a flat fee, which is more money than the shows now generate as a loss leader, basically to introduce their station and the concept of pay-per-view to the Japanese audience. We have little regarding details of the show other than after going the time limit in their previous 3 matches, Yuki Kondo knocked out Kyuma Kunyoku with a spectacular-looking knee and a 34-second slugfest to keep the King of Pancrase title in the main event. In the Vale Tudo Rules matches, Masakatsu Funaki beat former UFC competitor Tony Patara in just 1:16, landing a left hook and getting a mount and pounding away from that position until Patara tapped. Pride's Akira Shoji, just 6 days after going the time limit with Larry Parker, came back and went to a 15-minute draw with Pancrase's Ryushi Yanagisawa in a match said to be boring since both men were fighting with organization honor at stake not to lose. The other Vale Tudo match saw Sanae Kikuta beat Eddie Millis in 1:57 via submission. In Pancrase Rules bouts, number 1 title contender Semishult won via decision over Neo Blood tournament winner Ikuiza Minowa, and Yoshiki Takahashi returned and scored something of an upset, beating Asami Shibuya with a choke in 6:08 in what was said to have been a particularly entertaining match. Minoru Suzuki, who hasn't fought since December, will return on the final major show of the year for Pancrase on December 18th at Yokohama Bunka Gym. Rick Rufus pulled out of the K1 Grand Prix tournament due to an injury. The tournament starts October 3rd in Osaka, and Jerome LeBanner, a former big name in K1 who Don King signed away trying to use him as a draw, returns against Matt Skelton in a first-round tournament match. Frank Shamrock vs. Tito Ortiz match fell apart momentarily last week. Ortiz had signed 2 different contracts for future UFC fights, one more lucrative than the other. He was under the assumption that the more lucrative deal would be in place for the Shamrock fight, but instead they used a previous contract, or something like that. Anyway, it was explained to me that UFC was technically within its legal rights to do so, but Ortiz was pissed for legitimate reasons and pulled out for a day, but a compromise figure in between the two figures was reached to save the show. The incident where Enson Inoue punched the reporter, which resulted in him being suspended for life from Shooto and vacating their heavyweight title, actually took place at the August 19th Rings show. There is talk that Akira Maeda will be coming to the UFC this week to recruit fighters for the Rings tournament. John Peretti was named matchmaker this week for UFC Japan as well. Its first show is November 14th in Tokyo, and the only thing announced definitely is that Jason DeLucia would appear. The American version of UFC, also booked by Peretti, has a November 19th pay-per-view date tentatively headlined by Kevin Randleman vs. Pete Williams for the UFC heavyweight title. ECW. The plan is for the November to Remember show to most likely be from Indianapolis on November 7th. Nothing has been decided for the show, although Paul Heyman is considering a Taz vs. Rob Van Dam match and hopeful of being able to get Masato Tanaka in for a rematch with Mike Awesome. Even though the pay-per-view would make for a fitting exit for Taz, the plan is still for him to wrestle here until the end of the year, although WWF will start pushing him on television before that time and probably use ECW footage to do so, which, if so, indicates a continuation of the cooperation between the two companies. Heyman said he wanted Taz to cry on camera to get the belt over, but Taz was afraid it might hurt his image. Taz will wrestle Sabu on the September 24th TNN tapings in Plymouth, Michigan, and also have future matches against Awesome and Van Dam. Heyman said that he wants to stay away from Van Dam vs. Jerry Lynn now that it's back in everyone's mind, and to go back to it as a big pay-per-view match down the line. There have been some problems with TNN, among them ECW feeling that TNN is doing more and spending more on promotion of Roller Jam than ECW, despite ECW drawing higher ratings, and with the ratings not through the roof. There are problems almost every week regarding content of the show, including a complaint about the Beulah pregnancy angle from years back that was pushed in the retro clips on the Raven Dreamer feud. If they only looked back at the angle regarding Beulah being pregnant for months, never showing, and then it coming out the pregnancy was a work on Dreamer, and Dreamer staying with her anyway even though he hated her beforehand, the problem would hardly be the taste of the angle, but that it made as much sense as the Undertaker Kane or the McMahon family angles if you look at the stories backwards. Raven claims he is now 237 pounds off steroids, which is his natural body weight now as a result of having done steroids for so many years, and that he can get up to 245 or 255 on them, and he was about 220 as Johnny Polo in the WWF. Highlights of the September 17th TNN show. They announced the national ban of Sabu is over, which is good, since he was wrestling every night. I don't know how to explain this, since I've seen Bill Alfonso interviews for years on the ECW weekly show, but watching him on national TV do an interview drove a point strongly that he should never be allowed to do a singular promo on national television. They showed Spike Dudley beating PN News in 25 seconds in the same scenario they did with Spike for much of this year. They aired the final 2:30 of a Super Crazy vs. Yoshihiro Tajiri match, this time with Crazy winning with a power bomb. What aired was good. They did a lengthy Raven interview including a retrospective of his feud with Dreamer. Dawn Marie is now called just that, with the name Bitch dropped. The Beulah thing was dropped a long time back, I guess, when Beulah wouldn't come back and feud with her. The show was put together similar to Raw in that just before every break, they did a tease of something for the next segment. They kept showing an ambulance teasing that somebody was injured, which turned out to be Jerry Lynn, blamed on Lance Storm, and just incredible. Van Dam wrestled Storm, taking Lynn's place, for about 1 minute before Johnny Smith interfered. The Van Dam vs. Lynn match went 13:37 and was a 4.25 stars match. I thought the Juventud Guerrera vs. Blitzkrieg match at the WCW pay-per-view in Tacoma was slightly better, but it was close to the best American match I've seen this year. The fans were really into the near falls, especially after the restart. It was noticeably better than their match on TV the previous week, which I'd give 3.5 stars. WCW. Right now things are very strange as many are trying to politic and struggle for power. The booking is largely being handled by Kevin Nash, Dusty Rhodes, and Kevin Sullivan, with input from numerous others. The general feeling is the September 20th Nitro was a success, even if the ratings say otherwise. It's an interesting game because so many want power and different alliances are being formed and nobody can predict how it will eventually shake out. Nash in particular is going back to the same people he reached out to last year as their savior in the wake of all the frustration with Hogan's near-ending push, before he basically did almost the worst job of booking in history. Nash blamed his lack of success on the fact Bischoff would get involved and that he was always forced to push Hogan and wasn't allowed to push the younger wrestlers and promised he'd push them now. However, with Bischoff not around, the push of Hogan continued, which caused him to lose some credibility, but he did come up with a semi-major angle for the Mexicans, a rushed angle, but an angle nonetheless. Hogan seems serious about wanting more power. Hart wants input, feeling he at least understands how to book angles that make logical sense. Flair sees this as his chance to gain power as well. Backstage at Nitro was said to be the most relaxed things have been, due to Bischoff being gone, but there's no general feeling things are going to change for the better either. Several wrestlers had set up meetings this week with Dr. Harvey Schiller about the political situation. Speaking of Schiller, he responded on September 20th in USA Today in Rudy Martz's column, denying reports he was leaving Turner Sports. According to several sources, Schiller had considered for several weeks leaving for a job overseeing George Steinbrenner's sports empire pending the approval of Major League Baseball of Steinbrenner's purchase of the New Jersey Nets. Schiller would have run an operation which included the Yankees, Nets, a sports cable channel featuring the two teams, and a possible new arena built in New Jersey for the Nets. There were many reports that Schiller had denied interest in, and over the past week, several newspapers reported he was taking the job. Of course, he's publicly denied the story from the start. Nitro on September 20th in Cincinnati drew 11,634, 5,227, paying $158,485. Show opened with Psicosis and Juventud Guerrera beating Mysterio Jr. and Kidman in 4:48 when Psicosis pinned Kidman after Guerrera shoved Kidman off the top rope into a dropkick by Psicosis. Some spectacular moves and about as good a match as you'll get in less than 5 minutes. Highlight was Guerrera doing a guillotine leg drop on Ray as he was sitting on Psicosis' shoulders, not to mention Ray doing an Osai moonsault. After the match, Eddie G and Conan attacked Psicosis. Psicosis came out and spoke Spanish and issued a challenge and talked about the mask, but didn't say he'd put his mask at stake. Chavo Jr. came out as a translator saying Psicosis would put up his mask next week against Kidman's hair, which Psicosis acted made about the mistranslation, but the match was made and Kidman agreed to it. A ton of heat for the match, an angle and a super opening to the show. With Psicosis having already dropped his mask in Tijuana, and at this point there is no way they're cutting Kidman's hair, the result is easily predictable. Goldberg pinned Knobs in 2:24. This had as much heat as anything in any promotion in a long time. It was an amazing spectacle. Goldberg did an interview challenging Sid at Havoc. Originally they were going to hold this off for Starrcade. Flair challenged Sting for a match, but Benoit said that he had a contract for a title match with Sting and wasn't giving it up. The fans didn't like the idea of seeing Benoit wrestle Sting instead of Flair. Sting pinned Benoit in 15:02 of a pretty good match. This was weird in that Benoit wrestled heel style and Sting wrestled face style. Sting got more cheers than Benoit, partially because of how they worked and also because the crowd saw Benoit as a heel since he screwed them out of seeing Flair versus Sting. The crowd more seemed confused by this. Sting didn't look good and blew up late in the match, but Benoit put on an excellent performance to not just save it but make it good. This match had more drama and built better than any match on the ECW show the night before. After a missed Stinger splash, Benoit hit the diving headbutt for a near fall. He got the crossface but Sting made the ropes. Ref bump. Benoit hit a piledriver and then a German suplex, but no ref to count the falls. Finally Luger showed up and hit Benoit with a bat and the ref recovered to count the pin. Flair ran in for the save, but DDP laid him out with a diamond cutter and they beat up Flair until Hogan saved the day. This was so ass backwards. Benoit should be saving the day for Flair and Hogan if they want to elevate him, but of course, they don't. Berlin pinned Scott Armstrong with a neckbreaker in 3:40. The bodyguard hit Scott with a gloved hand. That's the gimmick Nash used, the gloved-handed bodyguard for Shawn Michaels in his early days as Diesel, and Berlin used the neckbreaker. Brad Armstrong came out to save his brother. The Berlin videos and presentation is awesome, but his follow-through in the ring hasn't been. DDP actually did a good interview. He ripped on Pete Rose and got a lot of heat. Can't believe anyone in Cincinnati still gives a crap about Rose. That city must be desperate for a sports hero. Evan Karagi's beat Blitzkrieg in 4:23 of a match where the winner was to get a title shot at Lenny Lane. No heat and real bad. Karagi's has a good look but he's not ready. He won with a screw off the top rope, which sounds like something WWF would try and innovate, except its wrestlers probably couldn't do it. Fans chanted boring. Blitzkrieg actually kicked out of the pin, which made the finish look worse. Sid came out and destroyed both guys, saying that as long as Goldberg doesn't lay a hand on him before the pay-per-view, he'll wrestle him at the show. Saturn pinned Guerrero in 7:38 of another good match when Douglas KO'd Guerrero with a chain. Saturn yelled at Douglas because he didn't want the outside interference, and Douglas basically told him it's business and he should take the win. Gene interviewed Hogan, calling him the people's champ, but the people booed that one. He did an interview plugging the six-man without giving any explanation as to why he's teaming with Flair, although he did mention that Hart did shoot comments about him in the media in the past. Lane kept the cruiser belt, beating Shaggy 2 Dope in 4:02. CGAFI ran in and Lodi punched him and the security took him away. He said that was it and vowed revenge on Lodi for breaking his heart. I guess he can do the lesbian angle with Lodi that Vince Russo wanted Sable to do with Tori. They worked hard, but it was Lane's worst title match as there were no transitions and sloppy spots. Lane pinned him after Shaggy collided with Lodi. Gene interviewed Rick Steiner, who called out Scott. Scott's arm was gigantic. The Earth, Sun and Moon must have been in a direct gravitational force together because Scott did a great interview, mainly challenging Hogan. T pinned Canyon in 4:29 with a missile dropkick. It was okay, but not as good as you'd expect from these two. Finally, Flair beat DDP via DQ in 5:52. Match was pretty hot. Flair got the figure 4 in the middle when Sting ran in. Flair then put Sting in the figure 4 when Luger hit him with the bat. Hogan tried to make the save, but Sting hit him in the knee with the bast. They ended the show leaving Flair and Hogan laying. That's 3 for 3 and Flair being laid out while gaining no vengeance in Angle since his return as a free man. Some preparation for the future has been done, as on Nitro, they set up one match for Thunder that was announced. Okay, it's Lenny Lane versus Evan Karagias, 2 for Nitro on September 27th in Atlanta at the new Phillips Arena, Kidman versus Psychosis, Hair versus Mask, which was a rushed angle, and Hogan and Hart and Flair versus Page and Sting and Luger, which was ridiculously rushed as there was no explanation by any of the Hogan-Hart-Flair trio, all of whom have long-standing legit and storyline problems with the other, as to why they would form an alliance without more build-up, even though the idea of them as a trio with a story backing it up should do business. They also have 2 matches for the October 24th Havoc pay-per-view, Sting versus Hogan for the title and Sid versus Goldberg theoretically for the US belt. The subtitle for the show, Watch the Horror Unfold, after the string of bad pay-per-view events, is unintentionally the most hilarious subtitle of a pay-per-view in years. After shows on September 15th in Norfolk and September 16th in Florence were cancelled, there will be a live Thunder on September 23rd in Norfolk as a make-up date. At September 14th Saturday night tapings in Roanoke, Virginia with the bad weather approaching, it was suggested to tape some matches in case the Norfolk show, Florence, was cancelled by late Monday, would be cancelled, and the office turned down the request and was left with no new footage. The current plan for next year is to do Thunder tapings every other Thursday and Friday, with the Thursday show airing live and the Friday show being a tape for the following Thursday, thereby eliminating the dead second Thunder show with a burned-out audience, but adding another day on the road. The idea is for the booking committee to largely book out the main angles months in advance, and plan ahead of time who needs to be at television as a cost-saving issue, since the company under Bischoff spent tons of money flying guys into television tapings that were never used. As best we can tell regarding the Nitro girls, there were big problems in the camp between Kimberly, who runs the troupe, and everyone else, to the point several of the women complained to Human Resources at Turner about their treatment. The Nitro girls won't be performing on Nitro until the end of the year, when the new ones from this weekly Star Search deal are on the team. The problems apparently have somewhat been alleviated. Ted DiBiase appeared recently on the 700 Club and confirmed he was no longer associated with WCW. In the Nitro match on September 6th, where Hogan pinned Page in a 6-man cage match, and Billy Silverman only counted 2 after the leg drop, but the match ended anyway, making people think Silverman was the world's most incompetent ref. The actual story is that during the show, Bischoff changed the finish, Hogan pinning DDP with a leg drop. Silverman was supposed to be told in the ring by the wrestlers, all of whom knew, but he wouldn't have, and nobody bothered to tell him, so he held up his count at 2. Biggest locker room joke is that Page is now going to buy a house next door to Bill Bush. There was minor heat on Benoit for doing the interview on September 13th, where he said that Sid had tapped out the night before but the ref didn't see it. Sid did tap out to the crossface, but he wasn't supposed to. Benoit wasn't supposed to bring it up because it would hurt Sid's invincibility, and I guess the end result is that Benoit is going to have to do another job for Sid down the line. Hall and Nash should be back on TV before the pay-per-view show. They are floating a rumor where they want to go to Japan and win the IWGP tag titles and come back with the belts, but it's highly unlikely this scenario would take place. Hall's divorce apparently became final last week, while Nash is also undergoing a divorce. Wonder what the over/under is on Hall once he goes on the road before his next incident. Stories of heart-suffering injuries to his mouth from the baseball bat shot are just working an angle. Jimmy Hart wants to have the announcers live for the next WCW Saturday night taping on September 28 in Rome, Georgia. There is also talk, although not finalized, of dropping those tapings completely next year and turning that show into a magazine-style show. Goldberg suffered a back injury while weight training on September 10th, but worked Baltimore even though he was in great pain. That's why he sold so much at the pay-per-view match with DDP, but he was feeling better as the week went on. Dustin Runnels is scheduled to debut in the next week or two and not as a member of the Cowboys. CGAFI, the Lodi fan who runs in every week, got popped in the eye legit by security on September 13th at the Chapel Hill, North Carolina Nitro. While Doug Dillinger and WCW security were clued into the angle, local security wasn't, and one of them that chased him down punched him in the eye. He got a black eye and was complaining a lot. A lot of veterans who were used to working the old territories where they had to fight their way out of fan riots were really mad about him complaining about taking one punch, but it is almost an unforgivable lack of communication when someone is injured because they forget to clue in security that they're doing an angle like that. Tori Wilson, who has disappeared from television, but you can see her all over every fitness magazine, has a 3-year contract and gets first-class tickets to every show. Except for the really top guys, hardly anyone gets first class. There have been drug tests the past 3 Mondays. Flair's daughter Megan will be married this week. Scott Steiner's back is still in really bad shape. Disco Inferno will be joining Chavo Guerrero Jr., Juventud Guerrera and Psicosis in a new group. The idea is that all 4 will be mad because they weren't asked to be part of the Filthy Animals. The current plan, which of course can change, is not for the Revolution to split up with Shane Douglas going heel, but for the whole group to go heel and feud with Filthy Animals. The actor taking Bischoff's spot as the major wrestling promoter in the WCW movie is named Joe Pantoliano, not Joe Pantalones, although he's widely nicknamed Joe Pants. They'll be filming wrestling sequences for the movie on October 16th and October 30th at the Grand Olympic Auditorium in Los Angeles. Shows this week saw WCW Saturday night tapings on September 14th in Roanoke, Virginia drew 1,161 paying $26,070 and September 17th in Greenville, South Carolina drew 3,078 paying $91,961. September 18th in Louisville drew 2,021 paying $47,985 and September 19th in Evansville, Indiana drew 2,683 paying $56,992. All with Goldberg over Sid via DQ as the headline match and Conan and Ray over Wyndham's. October 22nd house show at the Oakland Coliseum Arena has Flair and Hart vs. Sting and Luger in a cage, Heat vs. Steiners for tag titles, Bagwell vs. Berlin, Mysterio Jr. and Eddie Guerrero vs. Douglas and Saturn, Lenny Lane vs. Kidman for Cruiserweight title, Chavo vs. Miller and Meng vs. Disco. Berlin's bodyguard is named Jay Toot. Bret Hart wrote this about the death of boxer Randy Carver last week. The boxing world is saddened by the death of super middleweight Randy Carver. Carver was 25. It happened in Kansas City. The show did not go on. The fans did not riot. So much for Vince McMahon's lame excuse that he had no choice but to go on with the show as soon as they wiped Owen off the mat or else the fans would riot. Only an idiot would believe that. Vince is a lot of things, but he's no idiot. I don't even think he believes the fans would have rioted. It's a pathetic attempt to blame the wrestling fans for his own tasteless decision to continue the show. An insult that the fans don't deserve. I've heard Forum fans who were there when Owen was dropped to his death, and they were revolted that the show went on. In fact, a lot of people left. I applaud the dignified way that the fans in Kansas City handled the Randy Carver tragedy. They've proved to my point that McMahon's riot story is a cop-out that uses the fans as his scapegoat. McMahon didn't even have enough respect for the live audience to tell them that Owen was dead. They heard about it on their car radios driving home from the matches, while the replay of the show was already on television. The show didn't just go on. It went on twice. Actually, as it relates to that incident, not only was the boxing show stopped because the injuries to Carver were so severe, but that promotion had a return date in October, and when it was announced that Carver had passed away 2 days later from the injuries, they announced out of respect to him that they were canceling that show as well. Hart filmed a hip-hop video this past week for a Canadian group called The Rascals. WWF. Bob Gino Marella Gorilla Monsoon suffered a mild heart attack on September 19th which led to some pretty serious kidney and liver problems. Morella, 64, has had numerous health problems through the recent years due to diabetes, but in the past has always managed to come through. Vince McMahon, with the help of Austin, won the WWF title from Triple H on September 14 in Las Vegas. And because Vince always does the right thing for the business that made him, he didn't do the time-honored tradition and simply vacated the title. Remember all those stupid things everyone in the WWF said in 1997 about the idea of breaking the direct lineal descent of the belt being a threat to the livelihood of everyone working in the company, most of whom forgot that Shawn Michaels had already done it earlier in the year anyway? The explanation is that Vince is a man of his word and that he signed a contract saying he had to stay out of WWF business. Then Austin came out and said in the fine print, he could choose to void the contract and allow Vince to run the company. Vince said he'd like nothing better and Austin let him back. Now logic gets complicated, since if Vince was out of that contract, why shouldn't he defend the title? Then Vince said he was putting Triple H and not Austin into the six-pack match for the title because everyone hated Triple H and he wanted him beaten up, but that Austin could ref the match. Actually, he was called the enforcer since the refs are on strike, and Austin would then get a title shot at the winner. Actually, Austin and Vince already being friends and doing favors for each other after their feud makes Hogan teaming with Flair with no storyline explanation almost logical. Raw drew a sellout 11,879, paying $344,452 to the Compaq Center in Houston. The show opened with the aforementioned scenario of Vince vacating the title. Rock was nice to an older lady on her birthday. He seemed to be taking great pains not to be doing his catchphrases on her. Mideon, Big Show and Viscera attacked Mankind in the boiler room, the only boiler room filled with lockers in the building. I bet. Rock made the save. Jericho did an interview which led to his beating Mr. S on Monday nights, B.A. Billy Gunn on Saturday mornings when kids aren't watching in as great numbers after a non-turn position more in a face roll, due to Curtis Hughes DDTing him on the floor. Jericho's Lion Tamer at 429 is now called the Walls of Jericho. After a few more interviews, one with Rock and Mankind which was funny and entertaining and one with Undertaker which was neither funny nor entertaining, out came Ivory to defend her title against Luna. You'd think after last month's atrocity that they'd ban her from PPVs for life. She picked on a fan in the audience and invited her in, but it was Luna with a wig. I know, Luna wears a wig to begin with, so it was a double secret wig. And Luna pounded her ass and pinned her with a DDT in 29 seconds. The announcers couldn't decide if it was a match or a non-title match, although the bell rang and there was a ref. Henry attacked Brown doing an interview with a chair and garbage can. Dudley's beat Matt and Jeff Hardy in 221 with 3D on Matt. Stevie Richards came out dressed as a Dudley and Farouk nearly killed him. Acolytes were doing commentary vowing to do to them what they did to Public Enemy. Jarrett put the figure 4 on the makeup lady. Test and Stephanie Von Erich beat Jarrett and Deborah in 138 when Test gave Jarrett an elbow off the top and Stephanie pinned him. I've seen this stuff a million times when the promoter and his family become TV stars and it's never good. In this case, they spent a month building up for Deborah to finally blow her cool with Jarrett and help Chyna win the IC title, and they blow it off by having Stephanie already pinned Jarrett 1 week before the match. Jarrett blamed it on Deborah and put her in the figure 4 after the match. Undertaker was shown talking to Kane. In a tag title match, Rock and Mankind regained the belts beating Mideon and Viscera and Show even though champs were Show and Undertaker. I think Ric Flair is the president and it's Triad rules or Wolfpack rules. The lights went out and Kane came out and Undertaker said how Kane was going to show blood is thicker than water, but Kane clotheslined Show from off the top rope and again over the top. In the ring, Rock pinned Mideon with a Uranage and People's Elbow in 351. Mariana came out with a puffy face all bruised up. She claimed Chaz had beat her again. Chaz showed up acting like he didn't know what was going on. The cops arrested him. They should have arrested her on the charges of being the worst actress of all the women in the WWF, and with the standards being what they are, that's quite an accomplishment. I'm pretty sure Chaz is innocent because rumor has it that Mariana has been cheating on him with Jim Brown. Sean Stasiak pinned Steve Blackman in 224 in the ultimate battle of who has the least facial expressions in the universe. Venus came out with Blackman's bag. Blackman went into the bag for a weapon and pulled out a vibrator. Stasiak then schoolboyed him. Undertaker came out and cut another promo on Kane and called him out. Kane came out and was jumped by Show, Mideon and Viscera who poured gasoline on him and they pulled out a blowtorch to set him on fire. Mankind and Rock made the save with baseball bats. I was confused enough about Austin, after already being screwed by Vince for more than a year, and then double-crossed by Vince's first face turn a few months back, letting him back to run the company, but why would Rock be saving Kane? Al Snow had a funeral for Pepper and Bossman pissed on his grave. Bob Holly beat Bossman in 157. He broke a glass pitcher on Bossman's eye, which was cut open and swelling shut immediately. Even if the pitcher was gimmicked, and I don't know that it was, hitting someone in the eye like that is so dangerous. Crash hit Bossman with an object to lead to the pin. Brown attacked Henry, who was having fun at a strip club. Jarrett tried to hit Chyna with a guitar but missed. Finally, Shane left the dressing room where Vince was, and suddenly there was a forklift and Vince couldn't come out for his match. Test and Shane then wrestled Triple H and Chyna. Poor Triple H. He did another great promo and got no heat for it. Shane, Test and Triple H did the worst miss spot to open the match. Poor Triple H. Jarrett attacked Test and Chyna chased Jarrett to the back, leaving Triple H with both. Triple H ended up punching ref Tom Pritchard for the DQ, then used the pedigree on Test and on Shane and destroyed both with chairs. They claimed he had injured Test's injured shoulder. Show ended with Vince clocking Triple H with a chair. The refs are all doing a picketing angle spoofing the umpires in baseball walking out, so they are using guest scab refs on TV like Steve Lombardi, Tony Garea, Sergeant Slaughter, man has he packed on weight, Tom Pritchard and even timekeeper Mark Eaton. Steve Williams, in response to the recent indictment on failure to pay child support, is requesting a DNA test to prove paternity of the 8-year-old child of Patricia Fry of Sacramento. Williams claims Fry was with many of the wrestlers including Buzz Sawyer back in 1991, claimed the original default judgment ruled against him was because he was in Japan and never knew about it to respond. He was arrested and released in Shreveport on $25,000 bond. He has a hearing on October 5th to try and get the judgment against him overturned. He has a clean medical bill of health after battling the hamstring problems stemming from the famous Bart Gunn Brawl for All match last year, and has dropped 30 to 40 pounds, depending upon who you talk with, to about 255. WWF still has no interest in using him but can't fire him without just cause due to him signing a 3-year contract. WWF did book him on an FMW tour from October 14th to November 6th, and as mentioned in the Japan section, he refused to go. Several WWF officials tried to talk him into going, but when he maintained he wouldn't work in opposition to All Japan, the WWF lawyers claimed it was a contract breach and they're working on now getting out of the deal. A second deadbeat dad story surfaced this week. The story claimed former WWF wrestler Paul Tanaka was the deadbeat dad of the month, fathering a 7-year-old girl in Springfield, Massachusetts and hasn't paid any child support in 2 years, and owes more than $25,000. I presume who it is and the timing is right if they're working in the WWF, but wouldn't want to say anything if the dad was actually named Paul and not Tanaka. SmackDown on September 14th in Las Vegas opened with the refs on strike. Shane beat Joey Abs with Stasia counting the pin after both Patterson and Briscoe, as refs, were attacked by Rodney and Pete Gas. Ivory called out Cindy Margolis, and Jarrett put Margolis in the figure 4. Ivory loved it, but Jarrett then put her in the figure 4. I think there's a prerequisite in the WWF hiring process that the women to get the job need no wrestling ability, no acting ability, absolutely hideous deliveries, hard bodies, fake boobs and the willingness to get as close to naked to tease 12-year-old boys. I guess it drives ratings, but the least they can do is not let them talk or try and act. Blackman beat Henry via DQ when Venus hit Blackman with a low blow and Brown made the save. Test and Jarrett brawled, leading to a match later in the show. Shamrock beat Hughes with the ankle lock, but special ref, El Dopo Build from Mexico wearing a mask, DQ'd Shamrock. Dopo was unmasked as Finkel. This segment was hilarious, but Hughes doesn't have it at all. Jericho needs to get as far from him as possible because he's an anchor. A 5-man Rumble saw another creative way to keep Taker from wrestling. It was Rock, Mankind, Show, and Kane. It ended with Taker, who was announcing, getting into the ring and throwing Show and Rock out together to win. Chyna wrestled both Hollies by herself. Billy Gunn came out to be her partner and used the Famouser on Crash for the pin. After the match, Jarrett hit Chyna with a frying pan and put an apron on her and told her to cook him some supper. I'd be afraid to eat anything she cooked, because what if it made you talk like her? A guy in wrestling would be dead with that delivery. Snow beat Bossman with Pepper on a pole. Slaughter was the ref. Bulldog came out with the Rottweilers. The idea was Bossman had Pepper's remains but was treed by the dogs. It looked so stupid. He threw the remains to Snow, who was awarded the match. Bossman ran away. Jarrett and Test in 234. Posse and Terry Runnels came out. I guess they can always have her seduce Test at the bachelor party because she hasn't had anything to do of late. Stephanie came out. Jarrett went to put the figure 4 on her but Shane came out and speared him. Patterson and Briscoe were out there as well. Triple H did this awesome promo calling out Vince. Vince at first brushed it off, but he kept on insulting Vince's manhood, acting like he was going to show Linda who the real man was. You know, a real man always defends his girl's honor, so Vince went down there to confront Triple H and tell him he wouldn't wrestle him. When he finally got to the level of saying Vince couldn't get it up, Vince clotheslined him. Triple H destroyed Vince while Shane riffed. The match itself was super drama, although the crowd reaction was weaker than you'd think until the very end. Triple H destroyed Vince, including an elbow off the barricade onto the announcer's table, which collapsed but didn't break. He delivered a hard chair shot and Vince did the major blade job. He KO'd Shane with a chair shot as well. Linda, Patterson and Briscoe came out and Triple H and Chyna beat up Patterson and Briscoe. Finally, Austin saved the day, giving a stunner to Chyna and another to Triple H and putting Vince on top for the pin and title win in 8:52. TV Guide in the cheers and jeers section praised Shane and Stephanie McMahon for following in their father's footsteps and becoming stars in the family business. Whoever wrote that clearly has never studied recent histories of wrestling families. Undertaker, who can't wrestle much still due to the groin injury, was given the weekend off to attend the De La Hoya Trinidad match. Shamrock is wanting to leave and begin training for a UFC comeback. On September 13th in Anaheim at Raw, he was potatoed by a Rusty Hughes, and got upset and gave him a receipt back. This became exaggerated on the internet into the idea that they were shooting on each other. Shamrock then cut a backstage promo unscripted, not part of the show, and Hughes, which some claim appeared to be because Boss Rutan and Oleg Toktarov were there watching. Shamrock then asked to be taken off the cards because he wanted to start training for his return to fighting and didn't want to get hurt wrestling, claiming a neck injury in the skirmish. He wasn't given the weekend off, but didn't wrestle this weekend because of the injury, leaving Jericho without an opponent on the Texas house shows. The two are still scheduled for the pay-per-view show on Sunday. The two have only wrestled once so far, on September 12th in San Diego, and Shamrock was put over clean, perhaps partially because it was in his hometown. A lot of wrestlers were under the impression the hotel in Las Vegas was sold since it was under a new name rather than WWF Hotel, but it has not been sold. WWF still has someone on payroll to come up with a new site and build a new hotel after they unload the current one. Taz has yet to sign a WWF contract, although the belief is pretty much certain that he will within the next 2 weeks. He positioned himself strongly in the negotiations in recent weeks about not wanting to be in ECW anymore, that deals were changed on him and he was owed money. After the pay-per-view, Ian Heyman seemed to be getting along. Austin will be filming his first episode of Nash Bridges this season next week. He's supposed to film 3 episodes before the end of the year. Besides Raw, the other shows of the past week were SmackDown September 14th in Las Vegas, drawing 8,219, paying $191,173. September 19th in San Antonio drew a sellout 9,726, paying $235,578, and September 20th in Austin, Texas drew 11,179, paying $223,896. With no title match headlining since Vince was champ, they used Rockover Show as the main event in San Antonio and Rockover Triple H in a Falls Count Anywhere match in Austin. Local wrestler Venom worked both Texas house shows, defending his TWA, Shawn Michaels San Antonio promotion, title over Show Funaki, who works for Michaels as a trainer at his school. Merchandise for the 4 shows this past week was $306,782 or $7.48 per head, which is a noticeable increase in the per head merchandise business over recent months, which would tend to indicate new t-shirts are doing well. Several WWF wrestlers were at the Emmy Awards in Austin, and Rock appeared on the show itself doing their catchphrases on the highest-rated TV show of the week. Ratings from the UK. Keep in mind that Raw and Nitro are on satellite stations while WCW UK Worldwide is on network, thus it has a far greater audience. For September 3rd, Raw had 310,000 viewers, Nitro had 290,000 and Worldwide has 740,000. For September 10th, Raw had 230,000, Nitro had 240,000 and Worldwide is 820,000. The readers' pages. Bischoff. You're right. We should all give Eric Bischoff his due. After all, he not only ran his own company into the ground, but, at the same time, ruined the entire wrestling business in Mexico by signing up all of the top stars, thus depleting Mexico's talent pool, and then not using them. Then to top it all off, after having Mike Tenay go on and on about how important, and almost scared, the mask was to the traditions of lucha libre, he showed his respect for that tradition by unmasking those same wrestlers for absolutely no reason other than to prove he could do it. I'd say Leo Del Santo was very fortunate not to have signed with WCW, or else his mask would have been one of the first ones targeted. So yeah, give him credit for turning some of the best and most exciting wrestlers in the world into jobbers while cramming a bunch of over-the-hill and worthless names from the past down our throats. Maybe Bischoff should have sat down and watched a video of the 1989 Chi-Town Rumble pay-per-view back from the days they really did wrestle. You should check it out, it was really an amazing wrestling show. But then again, I doubt it would have made any difference. All I can say is, good riddance. As for Brian Hildebrand, he's now refereeing the kind of dream matches we only wish we could see today. James Hold. Houston, Texas. Hall of Fame. Thanks for printing my note. I realize that neither two gentlemen, Curtis Aokia or Johnny Barrett, were high on anybody's lists, but having been around the Hawaii circuit as a kid and having seen so many wrestlers come and go, those two people stood out to me. Jim Brooks. Cornelius, Oregon. I have to agree with reader Anthony Parillo on Lou Albano being in the Hall of Fame as a manager. I grew up watching the WWF in the late 70s and early 80s, and it was Lou Albano who enticed me to tune in every Saturday morning just to say what he had up his sleeve that week. Albano, as a talker, was second to none. His energy behind the mic had you glued to the TV. I'll never forget the attack he and Freddie Blassie along with Ray Stevens had on Jimmy Snuka. Albano had the ability to make you hate him, which in today's wrestling is a lost art form. Unfortunately, him being considered for Hall of Fame induction in my opinion has a lot to do with how he has handled himself the past several years in the media, which should have no bearing on the vote. Ray Gore. Wilbraham, Massachusetts. Response from Dave Meltzer. I believe Albano's career post-wrestling has had little to do with him getting or not getting votes. The exclusion of Mick Foley from the Hall of Fame is mind-boggling. If Bruiser Brody is in for brawling, then why isn't Foley? He's won the Brawling Award more times than Brody. He's coupled his in-ring skills with a reliability, unlike Brody, which has allowed him lengthy runs in each promotion he's set foot in, and as a result of that, he's been a world champion during a hot business period. Beyond that is the fact that in a cruel, backstabbing business, Foley remains dedicated and respected and a class act. I can't ever remember reading about a wrestler with a grudge against him. I've never heard that mentioned as a criterion for induction, but it ought to be. Sunday Night Heat may eventually lose ratings points, but it is a tremendously well put together show. The videos are near flawless, get the performers over and do it without the risk of burying anyone. I wonder though if the almost complete lack of kayfabe on the show is an attempt by Vince McMahon to ruin pro wrestling for everyone else. Either other promoters follow his lead or they'll come across as naive and with an archaic product to the casual fan. Matthew Wolfley. Dunkirk, New York. Response from Dave Meltzer. If being a nice guy played a part in the Pro Wrestling Hall of Fame, we'd have a completely different list of people in it. I'm surprised as well that Foley didn't get enough votes this year, and I can't really give an answer to why other than speculate people think he hasn't had enough years as a true headliner. With Shawn Michaels, I can at least say that the majority of wrestlers and people who at times have been major players in the profession voting did not vote for him. Most of those who didn't work in the business did vote for him. With Foley there was not that noticeable split, and there were comments made about his lack of professionalism and not being on top for long enough. With Foley, the only thing I can surmise is that people also don't see him as having enough years at the top, because he is pretty well universally respected. Personally, I think making a comparison to Brody doesn't bode him well because Brody would be very high on most lists of all-time greats. Brody was a headliner in every territory he appeared from his rookie year until the day he died and was internationally one of the biggest stars in the business of all time. And as far as foreign stars that have worked Japan, he'd be right up there with Hansen and Thez right at the top of the list. Although I believe Foley's best matches were every bit as good for their time as Brody's and he got more out of his physical ability than Brody did and was more of an overall professional in some ways, he wasn't in the same league as an athlete as Brody, and overall I don't think he was the level of worker that Brody was. Foley belongs because for better or for worse, he's had a tremendous influence in a new style of wrestling getting over in the US, and between his interviews and quality of his best matches, he's good enough. I'd be shocked if when all is said and done he doesn't wind up in any way. I also have a feeling he may someday wind up like that doctor who created Dianabol because he thought he was doing something patriotic for his country and regretted it because of the damage it caused the rest of his life. Foley has had less total time as a headliner than people like Sting, Luger, Undertaker, and even Barry Windham, who aren't considered strong candidates. The world title reigns, since the title seems to change hands almost weekly, and the list of champs this year include Vince McMahon, Triple H, DDP, Nash and the like, and now Sting has held it 9 times, don't mean as much today as in the past. It's not like so select few guys ever get the chance for it. He also has had as many great matches in the 90s as all but a few American wrestlers, which means a lot more than a one-day, one-week or one-month title reign. Regarding not breaking kayfabe on television, my feeling is that promotions that don't do the fake new work storylines already come across as archaic. Hildebrand. Great write-up on Brian Hildebrand. I'm going to miss him very much. He was a great friend and I'll always have him in my heart. I wish I could write more about him, but I could never do him justice. I spent some time with Pam the Sunday after the funeral and realized what a perfect match they were. The benefit show in Rostraver, Pennsylvania was my proudest moment as a wrestling fan. It restored some of my faith in the wrestling industry and human nature in general. Tim Dalton. Buffalo, New York. Ventura. I was mildly offended after reading Steve Yohei's letter in the September 6th issue. I'm a Minnesotan who voted for Jesse Ventura. Many Minnesotans were tired of politics as usual. His approval rating is much higher than the percentage of the votes that he got. We've hardly disgraced Minnesota and are glad to have someone who doesn't get embarrassed by his wrestling past. Steve Lockwood. Shoreview, Minnesota. Whether it's the clash of titans in the ring or the drama that unfolds outside it, we're here to break it down, match by match, feud by feud. Remember, in the world of wrestling, every day is a battle, and every victory is a story waiting to be told. Until next time, keep the passion alive, and never stop wrestling with the possibilities. This is the Pro Wrestle Machine,